Good morning. Thanks to everybody for coming today. I'd like to welcome you to the second meeting of the Commission's Advisory Committee on Diversity and Digital Empowerment. I know that since we last met in September, a lot has happened. The Commission in November adopted new media ownership rules, and as a part of that proceeding, we announced our commitment to get an incubator program up and running, and we issued an NPRM. As you know, the comment cycle is running on that right now. The Third Circuit has allowed our new rules to go into effect. However, they have asked for a status report on our incubator program, and we are looking to this committee to inform us and provide us some good lawful ideas on how we can move forward. I know you'll be talking about that today. I also wanted to thank all of the subgroups for all of the work you've been doing the past 6 months. I know that each of the 3 working groups has been working very hard, and I look forward to hearing about some of the thoughts that you have and some of the recommendations that you're going to be making to us. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that our fearless leader, Julia Johnson, is unfortunately sick, so she was not able to make the trip here this morning. But we have our other fearless leader, Diane Sutter, here, and she has graciously agreed to step in the shoes as chair to keep the meeting running today. And I also wanted to just take a moment and thank Jamila. These meetings do not happen magically. There's a lot of orchestration that happens behind the scenes. So I wanted to thank our DFO, Jamila, our deputy DFO, Brenda, and their team for pulling everything together today. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce the commissioners that are here to say a few words. First, I'd like to introduce Commissioner O'Reilly.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I appreciate the introduction, and welcome to everybody. I hope you don't mind. I've prepared remarks. My staff says I should stay to the script, so I will. It's a real honor to speak before you again to such a distinguished group of individuals. I've worked or met with many of you on so many occasions on issues before the Commission. You know my door will always remain open to hear your views, whether we initially agree or disagree on any particular topic. Whenever I think of FCC advisory committees, I'm reminded of comments that comedian Jim Gaffigan, one of my favorites, said about parenthood, and I think it applies here as well. He said, "Raising kids may be a thankless job with ridiculous hours, but at least the pay sucks." So I want to reiterate my appreciation to you for your willingness to serve, as I know it takes time away from your families and your professional responsibilities. At least the coffee is free, right? Or maybe not. As some of you may recall, I spoke before this group's inaugural meeting in September, just after Chairman Pai reconstituted it. In my September comments, I implored the committee to stay focused on those issue areas in which the Commission actually has authority to commence action. If it's not in this book or firmly constituted within its requirements, then you're likely to have a difficult time convincing me of a specific recommendation, no matter how brilliant or revolutionary it may be. That guidance still applies, in my opinion, so I hope you will keep it with you as the committee proceeds with its work. The main reason I'm here and why I'm so pleased to accept the committee's invitation to say a few words this morning is to reinforce the importance of the Commission's proceeding to create a small entity broadcaster incubator program. Let me be abundantly clear. The lead proponent of this idea is the chairman, and I've been happy to support his work on the topic. My goal today is not to step on the chairman's toes, but as a fill-in, seek for you to redouble your efforts on the issue and emphasize our collective interest in seeing a fulsome record and your robust recommendations on how best to go about creating an incubator program. We should all remember that the intent of the incubator program is to address the lackluster ownership of broadcast stations by smaller entities, which includes women and minority groups. All relevant data highlights the fact that our current media ownership limitations and prohibitions are not working. The television numbers remain in the single digits, and radio is not much better. Whether once well-meaning or done for protectionist reasons, many of our media ownership rules, crafted in the 60s and 70s, have led us to the abysmal state we find ourselves in today. In a recent congressional oversight hearing, the chairman and I were asked if our newly proposed rules at the time would improve the small entity ownership situation? My answer then and remains now that I think they are thoughtful efforts to develop workable solutions that are consistent with the law and recognize today's market realities. If you believe in a diverse makeup of station owners, then doubling down on failed policies makes no sense. We all know that some outside groups want the incubator program to fail. We should recognize that their ultimate goal is not to improve the small entity broadcaster ownership. Instead, it is a cynical and destructive play to undermine our media ownership rule changes currently under court review. They see this as a linchpin to preserve those outdated rules that are not working. The Commission should not be sidelined by such efforts. With that in mind, I would like to take a moment to highlight a few of my concerns with your draft proposal that I had a chance to look at yesterday afternoon. I want to be clear. I have long believed that advisory committees should be left from interference and free from too much direction from the Commission. That said, because I so strongly want this program to work, I feel like I must provide some initial feedback now before it's too late to make changes needed to garner my support later. First, let's search for new ideas. As I've stated earlier, our old policies have not worked. That includes the reestablishment of a tax certificate program. Such a program will be a heavy lift to get passed into law, especially in the near future. Second, I have concerns with the proposed 3 categories eligible for the incubator program. At this time, they seem too arbitrary and ripe for abuse. Third, I believe the committee's time would be best served focusing on ideas based on regulatory relief for existing stations willing to participate and capital and training assistance for those interested in obtaining stations. Maybe take a closer look at Diane's program and how she operates it. As it currently stands, the draft proposal is missing some of this focus. I'm confident, though, with the exceptional experience and background of the members of this committee, you are more than capable of working through all of these issues to build a successful incubator program that can be adopted by the committee and the Commission. This topic remains among the top of your priorities, so I hope you'll consider my feedback and come up with some additional ideas. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak before you, and I wish you well with the rest of your work today.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Carr, would you like to say a few words?
Absolutely, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation to get to say a couple quick words, and thank you all for your service on this committee. It's tremendously important. Picking up on Commissioner O'Reilly's point about unpaid work, kind of like being parents this morning, I could not locate the shoes for my 4-year-old after about 45 minutes of searching. And so he went to school with snow boots this morning, which was better, I guess, than no shoes at all. But it's questionable, yeah. But it is really great and heartening to see all of you here today. So many good and long-term friends, starting with Henry Rivera to David Honig to Chris Woods. I mean, everyone that's here, you know, I think most of you had some sort of personal interaction with and history with. Henry in particular, when I was a very baby lawyer just out of law school at a law firm, Henry was a partner there. And he took a tremendous and inordinate amount of time out of his schedule to talk with me, to mentor me, to help me along. And so anything good or bad that's happened since then, I think the mustard seed for it was those early discussions with Henry. But the work that this committee is doing is incredibly important. I mean, it's really the core of what we're about at the Commission. Whether it's broadband or broadcasting, we have a job to help make it easier to get this infrastructure out there. But to what end? You know, the most important end that I can think of is to give more communities a fair shot, whether it's online opportunity, digital empowerment, as this committee talks about. This is really the core of everything we do at the Commission. It's not just about, you know, pipes and tubes and getting the hardware and the infrastructure out there. It's for a particular purpose, and it's to give more people more opportunities. And so the input that you're providing to that process is incredibly important. It's something that I really look forward to embracing the work product that comes out of this. And you know, as I've gotten outside of D.C., I was a couple weeks ago was with Chris Wood. I will call it his grand opening of the LGBT tech headquarters in Stanton, Virginia. For those of you that don't know, Stanton is obviously in a very rural part of Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley. But because of broadband connections being there, he's able to launch his business there. We were able to talk to some people that were able to start their own businesses thanks to online connectivity. And it's stories like that, it's changes like that come from getting broadband out to what had been or could be underserved communities. Just up the road from there, we went to a small high school, rural high school in Woodstock, Virginia, and there's kids there that have an opportunity now to do anything because of a broadband connection. There was a provider that had just installed a new small cell outside of the school. The kids are getting iPads. We met with 2 or 3 junior or seniors that are interested in careers in STEM. And all of that has been enabled because they had broadband connectivity at school, and their horizons are really limitless because of that opportunity. A week later, I got the chance to go to East Baltimore, a community that is on the upswing. There's new after-school programs that are sprouting up. There's community gardens that are going in. And to me, one of the most important things, there's new small cells that are being deployed in this neighborhood. And for a lot of communities, particularly in those neighborhoods, mobile access, mobile internet is often the only on-ramp they have to the internet and to digital opportunities. So it's great to see these new small cells going in and helping to spur some more economic development in that area. And all that's why it's so important, going back to where we start, that we get more broadband infrastructure out there so we can replicate these results across many different communities. And last week, the FCC voted on an important decision. There's this new technology of wireless on the horizon. As many of you know, it's known as 5G. It's supposed to be faster, and it's going to enable a lot of interesting next generation opportunities, from autonomous cars to the Internet of Things to remote surgery. And for me, the key to success with 5G rollout is that it happen as ubiquitously as possible. If 5G ends up being an urban affluent play, whether it's New York or San Francisco or limited to those types of deployments, that's not success. One of the things that we saw in our rulemaking is that regulation on the broadband side is what's holding back a lot of deployments. We talk about the economics of deployment. Well, we saw that 30% of the total cost of deploying small cells was going to this regulatory red tape. By cutting that red tape, we're going to flip the business case for entire communities so that we'll get more 5G, get more broadband to more Americans. We say the same thing on the broadcasting side. I think we need to take a fresh look and a fresh start with our approach to broadcasting. The more regulatory red tape that we erect in terms of people getting into the business, of people staying in business, that narrows the potential people that can be successful, and it tends to narrow it to people that have significant financial backing. So how do we cut the regulatory costs? The Commission has been engaged in a number of important efforts, everything from streamlining reporting obligations to looking at our media ownership rules to JSAs to SSAs, things that can bring down the cost of getting into staying in this business. And I think that's going to be one thing that gets more opportunity for people in this space. And then finally, another issue that's important to me is workforce development, whether it's owning and operating a station or the actual jobs associated with broadband deployment. There's tremendous opportunity there. When we look at 5G, for instance, that's estimated to require a $275 billion investment in network deployment, which can create 3 million jobs. So one of the things I've been focused on here is how do I work, this is not something in my regulatory bailiwick at the Commission, but how do we work with Department of Labor? How do we work with other groups that can help create and improve apprenticeship programs so that we can put more people to work deploying these networks? So these are all the issues that I've been thinking a lot about recently, and it's why I think the work that you all are doing is so important, and I really will take a hard look and take to heart the recommendations that this great group puts together. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. And Chairman Pai sends his regrets. Unfortunately, he's unable to be here today because he is traveling. However, I see that a few members of his staff, including Allison Nemeth, his media advisor, are here. So hopefully you can chat with them during the break. Okay, without further ado, I will turn it over to Jamila Best Johnson, our DFO.
Excuse me. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Thank you, Commissioner Carr, for coming this morning. Good morning, advisory committee members, working group members, members of the public who are attending online or by the phone. We're excited about today's agenda. It does reflect a tremendous amount of work on behalf of everyone associated with this advisory committee. This group had its initial meeting in September 2017, and at that time, Chairman Pai charged you all to roll up your sleeves and dive into some very complicated issues. Well, today's meeting will demonstrate just how diligent this group has been examining issues of broadcast ownership, ubiquitous broadband service, and equity in access to tech jobs. So we're looking forward to a very full meeting today. We certainly want to thank T-Mobile for sharing their gratuities with us today. We have coffee and breakfast treats because of them, and they're also sponsoring our lunch. So thank you very much to T-Mobile, Marie, and to Shelley. And I would be remiss if I did not thank all of the FCC staffers who helped to organize and support this meeting today. I won't call anyone's name because I certainly would forget someone, and I don't want to do that. But this is the result of many hours of long, hard work by FCC staffers, including our Office of General Counsel, who clears many of you to participate as working group members. Our Deputy Designated Federal Officer, Brenda Villanueva, is attending via phone this morning, and I hope we can get Brenda on the line to say her welcome remarks. Brenda?
Yes, good morning, commissioners, chairs, and members of the advisory committee and working groups. I want to also express my thanks to all of you for all your active participation during these last few months. Several of you have spent countless hours thinking about and also working on important topics and the proposals that will be discussed today. So I want to also express my thanks for all your hard work today and for what is to come. I apologize for not being able to be there in person, and I look forward to the active discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. As Michelle mentioned, Julia Johnson is under the weather, and so we certainly wish her a speedy and a complete recovery. But our Deputy Chair, Diane Sutter, is going to ably chair this meeting today, and so without further ado, we turn it over to Diane for the calling of the roll and the official opening of this meeting. Diane?
Thank you, Jamila, and thank you, Commissioner, for your comments. We appreciate your support of this group. We'll take the roll now, so if you'll please just acknowledge your presence. Kathleen Abernathy?
Here.
Maria Brennan?
Here.
Rudy Brioche?
Here.
Ron Busby? Victor Serta? Heron Contractor?
Here.
Bridget Daniel?
Here.
Jeanette Dates?
Here.
Donna Epps?
Here.
Marita Coley?
Here.
Heather Gate?
Here.
David Honig?
Here.
Janice Bryan Howard? Ron Johnson?
On the conference call.
Thank you. Sherman Kizart? Here. Fatima Kathari?
Hi, you're joining by
Thank you. Maria Lopez?
Is that Mario?
Mario, excuse me. Mark Morial? Gavin Logan?
Here.
Henry Rivera?
Yes.
Alfredo Rodriguez?
Here.
Brian Scarpelli?
Here.
Cindy Show? Marie Sala Dixon? Nicole Turner Lee? James Winston?
Here.
Chris Wood?
Here.
Is there anyone who is present whose name I did not call? All right, would you please state your name for the record?
Shelley Blakeney, T-Mobile. I'm alternate to Marie Silla Dixon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Elizabeth Lindsay, I'm with Bite Back.
Laura Barraclough, Charter Communications.
Chloe Miller at Facebook, subbing for Brooke Oberwetter.
Excuse me, I think some of you are actually working group members as opposed to members of the commission, the VACA group. So we appreciate your participation, and we will acknowledge you at a later time. So thank you. But those of you with yellow name tags, is there anyone else who we did not? All right. Yeah, Cindy has just arrived. Thank you. And anyone else? And do we have everyone who's on the phone? All right.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I believe we have a quorum.
Yes, we do.
Excellent. So we will proceed. I know if Julia were here, and I know she regrets not being able to be here, she would want to thank everyone for the work that you have done. Both she and I have been following what you have been working on, and we have sat in on many of your conference calls and know they have been spirited discussions. They have been full of great comments, and certainly a lot of work and input on the part of everyone at this table. I appreciate everything that you have done to get us to this point and look forward, I think, to hearing some very interesting things from each of these groups to show you how much they have been working toward the goals that have been set by the Commission for us. As we begin to have these reports, I would ask the Chairman if you would also introduce those from your working group who are here with us so that we may thank you for your participation, because not only do we have the members of the committee itself, but we have others who have contributed to this and become part of the working group and have contributed greatly to those things that we have been doing. So we're going to start with the Broadcast Development and Diversity Working Group. Henry, as the chair, would you please take over from this point?
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you.
So in November of last year, as Michelle mentioned, the Commission issued an NPRM proposing the adoption of an incubator program. The NPRM noted that the Commission anticipated that this advisory committee would assist it in developing such a program. Chair Johnson believed the working group on broadcast diversity and development was the appropriate one to assume the responsibility for drafting the comments to assist the Commission. And the working group agreed, and we set out to respond to all or most of the questions the Commission asked in the NPRM. Given the enormity of the task, I deemed it best to divide the working group into 3 task forces, each to address a discrete portion of the NPRM. Every member of the working group self-selected into one of the 3 task forces. Task Force A, chaired by Maria Brennan, addressed those portions of the NPRM dealing with eligibility for incubation and covered overcoming the disadvantages, preference, new entrants, revenue-based eligible entities, and mission-based educational institutions. Task Force B was chaired by Jim Winston, by Dr. Jan Dates, and that task force addressed those portions of the NPRM that were dealing with the incubation activities and incentives for incubating stations. Task Force C was chaired by Jim Winston. They addressed those portions of the NPRM dealing with the integrity of an incubator program, such as independence of the incubated entity and review of incubation proposals and compliance assessment. David Honig agreed to serve as a working group rapporteur and sat in on all the task force meetings, took notes, and ultimately drafted the comments. Each task force had 2 or 3 meetings prior to the end of last year. The entire working group met early this year to hear the task force chairs report on their work and conclusions. This was to give everyone an opportunity to offer input to the work of those task forces of which they were not members. David then began the arduous task of drafting the comments. He and I traded many drafts, and the 16th iteration went to the entire working group for review and comment. Several suggested edits were received and incorporated, and version 18 was sent to the working group for a final review before sending the document to Chair Johnson for distribution to you. Chair Johnson sent the draft to you for review on March 14th. No comments or suggested edits were received, and the document you received on March 14th is the one in your packets, and it's the one that we will be voting on today. So my thanks to the task force chairs and all working group members for all their hard work producing these comments. Particular thanks to David for all of his efforts. Without David, I have no doubt that we would not have been able to produce the comments that are before you for your consideration. And the working group does recommend that you approve these comments and that we file them in the proceeding that was initiated with the NPRM in November. I will now turn it over to David to provide you with a very brief overview of the document and to respond to any questions you may have. Since you've had the comments since March 14th, and in the interests of time, David will provide a brief summary as opposed to a line-by-line review of the document. David.
Thank you, Henry, and Diane, for your very kind words. Members of the Advisory Committee, the draft you have reviewed reflects well on the reason we have federal advisory committees. An advisory committee pulls together some of the best minds in the nonprofit sector, the industry, and academia to tackle issues that have defied resolution, sometimes for decades. In the case of broadcast incubators, there's a very long history. A broadcast incubator program was first proposed by Jim Winston, seated to my left, of NABOB in 1990, 28 years ago, through FCC Chairman Alfred Sykes' Minority Ownership Task Force, which I had the privilege of co-chairing with the late Zora Brown. Several different incarnations of the incubator program have been proposed since 1990 in 7 dockets, but none of these proposals became law. So the Broadcast Development Working Group, on whose behalf I speak today, decided to start over and create our own model. We began by establishing these goals. First, to create a pathway for entrepreneurs with management experience, including minority and women entrepreneurs, and especially those who have overcome disadvantages, to acquire broadcast ownership experience and ultimately become owners. Second, to create a sufficient incentive for industry leaders to create incubators, allowing these industry leaders to grow their businesses while sharing with others opportunities these leaders enjoyed earlier in their careers. Third, to avoid creating ownership consolidation and instead bring about deconsolidation and deliver new voices to the airways. And fourth, to design a program that would operate with the highest integrity and with minimal potential for abuse and lend itself to monitoring and classical cost-benefit analysis. The need to incubate new voices is especially urgent now in light of profound changes in market demographics since the last time Congress calibrated the broadcast ownership rules. Demographic changes since the 1990s underscore the need to provide more broadcast outlets for new voices, and especially for voices speaking in a variety of languages. In particular, between the 1990 census and the 2016 census estimates, our population has grown from 248.7 million to 323.1 million. That's 30%. The number of ethnic minorities, including Hispanics of any race, has grown from 49 million to 88.4 million. That's 80%. And the number of primary speakers of languages other than English has grown from 31.8% to 64.7%. That's 109% increase in just a generation. Few issues of communications policy are more urgent than the need to incubate a new generation of diverse broadcast owners to serve our much larger and much more diverse population. Our draft comments are unavoidably long because the Commission gave us 57 questions to answer, and we tried to answer all of them. The Commission asked us to address, quote, eligibility criteria for the incubated entity, appropriate incubating activities, benefits to the incubating entity, how such a program would be reviewed, monitored, and enforced, and the attendant costs and benefits, unquote. First, what are the eligible entities that would become the incubated companies? We examined several potential definitions of an eligible entity and recommended 3 types of eligible entities that appeared constitutionally permissible, easy to administer, not susceptible to abuse, and not so dilute that minorities and women would barely be included. The 3 types of eligible entities that we recommend for incubation are, first, Individuals who have overcome significant disadvantages, this is called the Overcoming Disadvantages Preference, or ODP, a race-neutral concept recommended to the Commission unanimously in 2010 by the Advisory Committee on Diversity for Communications in the Digital Age, our predecessor body initially chartered in 2004 by Chairman Michael Powell. Second, mission-based entities, such as historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, that are defined by their mission and not by race. And third, Native American nations, which are recognized by treaties and thus are not defined by race. Next, we asked how incubation would work in practice. We arrived at two models that seem to have great potential for success. The first we call joint ventures, and here's how it would work. An incubating company and an incubated company would jointly own and operate a full-service radio or television station for a period to be determined by the Commission, a length of time called the incubation period. We do not recommend a specific time period, although we generally felt that 3 years would work in most cases. Here's how the joint venture model would operate. During the incubation period, the incubated company would exercise control while its principals are being trained by the incubating company for long-term ownership. Most of the financing would be provided by the incubating company, but some of the financing, most likely through a line of credit, would be contributed by the incubated company. At the conclusion of the incubation period, the incubated company would exercise a call option to acquire full equity ownership of the station. Upon the closing of that transaction, if Congress passes authorizing legislation, the incubating company would receive a tax certificate entitling it to deferral of capital gains taxes upon reinvestment in comparable property. There are 4 distinct advantages of the joint venture approach. First, because it is built around a specific station, there can be no disparity between the assets subject to a tax benefit and the assets subject to incubation. Second, because both parties have resources at risk, the structure of the relationship itself will disincentivize gamesmanship. Further protection from fraud would be provided by strict requirements that joint sales agreements, JSAs, and shared services agreements, SSAs, would be employed only in exceptional circumstances for the first year of operation, for startup training, and only upon proof of need. Remember, that was the original purpose of those tools. They must be used only to assist in and never to substitute for incubation. Third, the joint venture approach is not premised on waivers. Thus, not only would the joint venture approach create new voices, it would not create an exception to the multiple ownership rules. Its entire effect would be to bend toward deconsolidation. Fourth, because the assets that could give rise to a tax certificate are likely to be high-value properties, such as full-power TV stations or major market FM stations, there will be strong incentives to operate these incubators with high-performing managers who will graduate and become high-performing owners. In addition to joint ventures, the other model that we think works well is a major institutional gift of a station to a mission-based entity such as an HBCU or Native American nation. Upon the making of a major institutional gift, the incubating company would be entitled to a tax deduction, or even better, if Congress so authorizes, a tax credit in an amount equal to the appraised fair market value of the donated station. For both of these models, joint ventures and major institutional gifts, the incentives to incubating companies would be grounded in tax policy. History teaches us that this would be a sound choice in light of the FCC's highly successful history operating the tax certificate policy from 1978 to 1995, during which time the policy quintupled minority broadcast ownership. We have concluded that an incubator program that draws from the best elements of the tax certificate policy has an excellent chance of success both in impact and in ease of execution. Further, we believe that our incubator proposal offers the best opportunity in years for Congress to authorize a program that would have an impact comparable to the original tax certificate policy. Under our model, only incubators would trigger tax relief to the seller or donor. Thus, when analyzed from the point of view of national tax policy, our model would be scored by the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, as modest in size and narrowly focused. For every qualifying transaction, the taxpayers would be underwriting something of great value to all Americans. In closing, the Broadcast Development Working Group commends this proposed incubator program to the full committee as a reasonable method of advancing diversity and inclusion in the nation's most important and influential industries. We believe it would serve the public interest and could make a profound difference in the lives of broadcasters, entrepreneurs, and consumers of all backgrounds. I would like to particularly acknowledge the many hours of editing and analysis contributed by Committee Chair Julia Johnson, our Working Group Chair Henry Rivera, and our task force leaders Maria Brennan, Dr. Janet Dates, and Jim Winston, as well as the pro bono service provided through MMTC on the Overcoming Disadvantages preference by Covington and Burling's Jonathan Blake and Harris Wiltshire's Christopher Wright, who's here with us today, and by Broadcast Development Working Group member and television station owner Duane McCoy, who is here as well, who conceived of the joint venture concept that the working group adopted. If these comments are approved, minor non-substantive editorial privileges are respectfully requested in advance of their formal submission on ECFS. I'd be glad to respond to questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry and David, and to the whole committee. Before we go to comments, I would just like to acknowledge those members who are additions to the members of the committee themselves that have volunteered their time to be part of that. That includes Sarah Lomax Reese from WURD Radio, Duane McCoy, Bayou City Broadcasting, Steve Roberts from the Roberts Companies, who has previously served on this FACA prior to this, and Michelle Duke from the National Association of Broadcasters. So we thank you all for being here as well as for your participation in helping to form this. So thank you very much. We're going to open the floor to questions and comments. I would ask that when you do speak, you would provide your name and your organization so that for the record we may keep a good record of this. And I would just like to start by perhaps asking the committee, we just heard the commissioner mention that he was hoping that this would not require any kind of regulatory approval beyond the FCC, and the group has suggested a waiver. Can you address that waiver would have to come from, I'm sorry, it is a minority tax certificate, which would be coming from Congress. How do we work with what we can do in the FCC versus what would be necessary to get congressional action on?
Well, there's a portion of this, the portion that relates to major institutional gifts that could be implemented now, in which the incentive is based on a tax deduction. That doesn't require congressional approval, but most of the great value would require congressional intervention. We're very fortunate that the Commission has a good relationship with Congress. Much of what the Commission asks for does require congressional approval, so it's accustomed to making proposals that Congress has to act in order for them to take effect. So this is not an unusual entreaty. And in this case, what the difficulty in getting the tax certificate or something like it back has been the fact that that as under the previous paradigm, virtually any transaction that is done to a small business that's not an incubator would have been eligible. And thus the taxpayers have been asked, in effect, under that paradigm, to approve virtually every transaction, so it would be, and then you'd hit a cap. So it's just who files in January. That's been the hang-up. But if only an incubator is before the Commission for approval, that's a much narrower, much more focused program. I really think, having been involved in trying to get Congress's attention for the last many, many years, that this solves that problem, and that Congress would be, I think, quite favorably look at this with this kind of proposal much more favorably than it has, and thus allowing them the opportunity to not bring back what is apparently never going to come back, but to deliver something that, when scored, would deliver as a matter of tax policy a new model that works much better than what they've had before, and much better than what we would do if we had something based on waivers. You couldn't. It was just fortunate that, frankly, that we came up with this, because it, I think, solves that problem. So we view this as a good thing.
Thank you, David. Are there other comments from members of the group? Sherman, I'm sorry. Did you have a comment?
Yeah.
Jim, please. And please just state your name and organization, please.
Jim Winston, President, National Association of Black-Owned Broadcasters. Yes, we did hear Commissioner O'Reilly make some comments about the proposal that includes a proposal for the tax certificate. And I wanted to respond to his comments because he said two things. He said, one, it would be a heavy lift in Congress. I agree with him fully there. Getting legislation through is always a heavy lift. But he also said he thought it was wrong to propose a previously failed policy like the tax certificate. And that is clearly incorrect. And I take issue with him on that point. As David pointed out, minority ownership quadrupled during the time that the tax certificate was in effect. I had the privilege of serving at the FCC when the tax certificate policy was adopted. I was legal advisor to Commissioner Robert E. Lee at the time. And then I went on to become executive director for a while, and now president of NABOB beginning in 1982. And so I can testify to how well the tax certificate had operated from the time it was adopted in 1978 until 1995. And what happened was one bad transaction caused Congress to eliminate the policy in 1995 after dozens of very successful tax certificate proposals were adopted and granted by the Commission. It was an unfortunate situation because the proposal that came in 1995 was so clearly inappropriate for the grant of a tax certificate that the Commission could have denied a tax certificate and saved the policy, but by not acting at all, the Commission left the issue open as if it was going to be granted, and so Congress killed the whole policy at that time. So I think David has given you excellent explanations as to why the tax certificate policy was proposed by the committee, and I think that that a review of the history of that policy would support that bringing it back would be the most effective way of increasing ownership in this industry.
And your proposal also proposes to include women in this, which the original tax certificate did not.
Absolutely. It's neither gender nor race-based.
Thank you. Are there other comments from the group? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Marita Coley, acting CEO of MMTC, Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council. And I'd like to echo what Jim Winston said in terms of I think the committee's done an exceptional job, and particularly any iteration of the tax certificate is something that I personally support, and on behalf of MMTC, because it has been the single most effective tool for ensuring minority ownership in media. And as Jim indicated, I was a young communications lawyer back in the day, and we vetted dozens of tax certificate transactions before the Commission even saw them, and used our expertise to ensure that they were in compliance with the Commission's tax certificate policy. And I agree that just one, quote unquote, bad transaction or failed transaction tainted the entire program, and that was totally unfair. So I appreciate the committee's work, and I'm glad to see the tax certificate coming back, and hopefully coming back in some iteration.
Thank you. Other comments? Yes, Sherman.
David and Commissioner Rivera, given Commissioner O'Reilly's comments and concerns, does that create a potential hurdle for our recommendation kind of moving forward with the full Commission? And if so, what would be the best way to address that?
Well, I think he expressed three concerns. One we've just discussed relating to tax policy. The second concern was whether these models lend themselves to abuse. Two of them relating to Native American nations, that's defined in the law. It's not susceptible to abuse. HBCUs is defined in the law. It's not susceptible to abuse. Overcoming disadvantages was approved unanimously by our predecessor body, has been well defined, and I think the proposal has not been one of the. I've never seen an attack on it based on the possibility of abuse. I've seen questions raised as to whether it is subjective, but I think in the comments it answers very well the question of how to deal with any subjectivity, which is a different question than abuse. So the other objection that he raised was whether the program sufficiently emphasizes training. And the joint venture model, and I would ask if it's permissible, Madam Chairwoman, for Dewan McCoy, who came up with this model of joint ventures, to speak to how that works as far as incentivizing training and the type of training that the program that you started at the NAB, which the Commissioner mentioned, incentivizes training.
So, Dewan McCoy, Bayou City Broadcasting. I'm a product of a program out of the NAB called the National Association of Broadcast Leadership Training Program. It's called BLT, okay? And the purpose of BLT is to train, educate, and teach senior level broadcasters how to operate, own, and purchase broadcast TV stations. I participated in the program in 2007 and immediately bought 7 TV stations out in West Texas, which included 2 Fox affiliates. I divested those television stations in order to purchase larger market stations and ended up buying 5 more TV stations, 2 in Evansville, Indiana, and 3 in Lafayette, Louisiana. So the program has currently 289 graduates that are prepared to be incubators.
And 18 in this year's class.
Prepared to be incubators in both radio and television. And it is it is the most renowned and respected program in America for people that are interested in purchasing television stations and radio stations.
If I could just add, I think when you have a joint venture and both parties in it therefore have invested money, have skin in the game, that's, as the comments point out, that's a pretty good incentive to be sure that the party in control is going to be receiving training that will enable them to run a profitable business, because the party that is providing the most of the money is going to want to be sure that it's getting its return. So the structure of the venture itself incentivizes the doing of the training, much more so than perhaps just the giving of a gift would. That was what appealed to the working group.
Yeah, I was being part of the working group. I was able to provide a perspective from the current ownership standpoint or viewpoint. Not only was I thinking from my perspective, but I talked to a lot of owners in America. I talked to the biggest group owners in America, and I've thrown out tea leaves to see what would be of interest to them. And I got to tell you, there's no consensus. Okay, there are large operators in America that are more interested in a tax certificate. Okay, there are some operators that are more interested in waivers. Okay, there's no consensus amongst the broadcasters that will be the incubating companies. Okay, and from my standpoint and from an owner standpoint, if there is no incentive for the incubating company to be an incubator, this program won't happen. Okay, because they have to be the leaders and they have to be incented to want to participate to grow women, minority, small businesses as it relates to broadcasting. Most of these incubating companies are public companies. And what's important to public companies is that bottom line and what's in it for them. And if they can't share with their shareholders what benefit of doing an incubating program would mean to their company, more than likely they will not do it. Okay, so while on the working group, throughout the 6 months that we worked together, a lot of that was taken in consideration from a lot of different people, not just the working group.
Thank you.
I'm Mark Morial of the National Urban League. And I want to compliment the working group for coming up with this idea and this concept, and just offer this perspective. You know, I joined this advisory committee because I wanted to lean into doing something about ownership. We've lost tremendous ground when it comes to minority ownership of broadcast and communication assets over the last 25, 30, 40, and all we hear is excuses, rhetoric about something that happened 25 years ago. And I think that we have an obligation, if this working group is going to be true to what we've been established, to, if you will, advance ideas that would address this problem, because while minority ownership has declined, media ownership has become more concentrated. And the reality, that's the reality of the here and the now. And so in complementing it, I think we at the National Urban League support it, and certainly there's a lesson that those that object have to learn. Good can never be the enemy of perfect. And if we held the standard up to federal programs, that a problem here or even a scandal there is a reason to toss the program out, every program would get tossed out. That's the real deal around how this works. So I strongly support it and know it could probably be tweaked and improved. And I also don't think, my view is that we ought to think of things that the commission can do. But I also don't think we should just sit there and shake because we think Congress might not do anything. Congress is an evolving institution. Who sits today might not sit a year from now. Who sits a year from now might not be sitting 3 years from now. I mean, we have to address the problem of diversity, and one of the most important problems of diversity that we face is ownership. So I support it. I'd like us to think bigger. I'd like us to think broader. This is a modest proposal to try to reignite, if you will, and put something out there that could try to address this huge challenge that we have, which is ownership of media assets in this country. So I just want to say that and really appeal to all of us to think. But we're an advisory committee. We can't make policy, but we have to, in good faith, recommend the policies that we think will make a difference, and not sit and shake like a leaf because we think someone might object or someone might have a problem or someone might not like it. I'd rather go sit down with the person who has an objection face to face and talk to them candidly about what we face. And I always say, okay, if you don't like this idea, come up with a better one. But to sit and do nothing is just not an option for me as a member of this working group.
Thank you. Yes.
So speaking as an economist, you kind of see that.
Would you give your name and your
Hurricane Contractor. I'm supposed to be a subject matter expert on this group. So speaking as an economist, you see the demographics of the country changing. But as Mark pointed out, there's increasing consolidation, and the consolidation by these companies may not reflect the changing demographics of society at large and what the content or these people want to see in the communities. So it's probably, this makes sense because it's good business sense. You want to have people who look like society start owning these media companies, start reflecting the content that is demanded. They keep saying, oh, people aren't going to go watch this. People aren't going to watch a superhero film with a lead actor that's African American. That clearly was not the case, right? They've been saying this for so long. People aren't going to watch a woman lead actress, That clearly wasn't the case last year. So when you start making these changes to these, current establishment and start seeing these things change, then you start reflecting the new society that's coming about. And that is a hard fact, and it's something we cannot run away from.
Thank you. Yes.
Wilco Electronic Systems. Just to echo Mark and Haron's comments, I love this proposal, and I think it's modest, like Mark said. We sit on the Diversity and Tech Working Group. It'd be interesting if it goes through, if we could see this as a pilot, because that type of incubator could easily traverse across the Access Working Group and the Diversity and Tech Working Group. Ownership is needed in all of those 3 areas. Technology companies definitely need incubation. They need access to capital. They need tutoring. They need mentoring, just like broadcast stations and just like broadcast owners. This is a pilot that I think could be very interesting to watch. And if we're able to get the backing to support it, I think we could easily, at least not easily, but at least with some context and some putting our heads together, see how we can do this and look at the model. If we can at least create a model around it, around the other working groups, because I think it can easily be just traversed and language to all of the various needs that we have for diversity in tech and diversity of ownership and technology.
Thank you. Yes, Kathleen?
One minor last point to respond to the question is that the Commission specifically asked for input. The Commission is specifically asking, how do we improve and gain some traction to deal with this fact about media ownership and consolidation? So I think the whole point is to put some really creative ideas in front of the FCC, and then you don't stop at that point. There'll be follow-up, there'll be questions, there'll probably be replies, but the first step is to get creative and put specific information in front of the FCC because they specifically asked for that information. And I think it says a lot that so many people around this table have devoted their time and resources to what is a very well thought out, well developed proposal that addresses a lot of the very thorny back end issues that led to the collapse of the first tax credit, and hopefully there is a new path forward. So I think this is great that people put their thinking caps on, coordinated. I can't thank David enough because I know how committed he's been over the years, and Jim and Henry. So this is a great first step.
Thank you.
Diane, can I say one last thing? Just to dovetail on what Mark talked about on ownership. A lot of times when we do these working group programs and we talk about the incubator, okay, the incubator is not the end goal. Okay, the incubator is a step to get to the end goal. And I think it's important to keep in mind that we're not trying to get an incubator program started here. Okay, we're trying to get ownership in the hands of women, small business, people of color, not the incubator program. So I think it has to be measured, and I think we have to start it, and we have to see it all the way through.
Thank you. Yes.
Janet Dates, Howard University, retired. I think one of the things we are concerned about, which causes some of the fear that is discussed, is fear of failure. Fear that the whole pot that we're so concerned about somehow is going to get dragged down. And I think it's very important for those who think strategically to strategize and figure out ways to work with some of the reluctant people who can be pulled over to help make this succeed. I just think it's very important to strategize carefully.
Thank you. Other comments from around the table? Are there any that are sitting in the audience that would have a comment? Yes, please. There's a microphone right there, if you would. And please identify yourself.
Sure.
Thank you.
You're brief, but I'm going to. Okay. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is David Morgan, and I'm here today in my capacity as president and co-founder of the Multicultural Media Correspondents Association, a nonprofit organization that has created a common ground environment for strategic engagement and consensus problem solving by media stakeholders and supporters committed to increasing media diversity ownership. First, I want to say thank you to the committee for all your hard work in crafting this proposal. I, too, agree that it's exceptional. I would especially like to acknowledge the leadership of Chairwoman Julia Johnson and Vice Chair Diane Sutter that are leading the charge on this effort. My comments are brief. I just want to express my desire on behalf of the MMCA to support this committee's efforts. Specifically, we'd like to take the opportunity to share the work you're doing to our community, which I think will be very happy to see what you're doing, and to sort of allow them to engage. I'm sure that the thousands of diverse media stakeholders that are looking for an opportunity to enter and to get a foothold in the market will welcome this proposal. Our website, the mmcadc.org, will be the vehicle that we'd like to use. Conversely, we would like to work with this committee to provide ideas from our community of diverse media stakeholders that I think could be helpful. For instance, with regards to the tax incentive, we encourage the committee to continue pursuing that and also to look to the recently enacted Investment and Opportunity Act as a potential way to structure those incentives in a way that the Congress might find palatable. This could potentially be a powerful tool to help these disadvantaged companies raise capital and the incentive we might need to get the companies to engage. I would also like the committee to encourage the committee to learn more about what we're doing at the MMCA has on the way. We plan to host panels and get folks together to sort of engage and look at some of these issues. And on May 24th, we'll be hosting a specific panel looking at sort of unconscious bias and other issues that are affecting media ownership. And that dinner, as many of you know, we'll be hosting our third annual Multicultural Media Dinner that brings all of these groups together for engagement and to support and to really bring the elevate this issue. In fact, we'll be calling in May for the entire month to be focused on media diversity ownership and to Congress to elevate this as a priority issue. So I'm interested in sharing with the subcommittee as we go forward more about what we're doing and ways that we can support and engage your efforts. Thank you for your time again.
Thank you for your comments. Anyone else from the public that would like to address this group? And are there any comments from those on the phone? All right. Henry, would you like to propose the recommendation? Which all of you, by the way, have the recommendation in your packet. You may want to take that out.
Yeah, the working group recommends the adoption of these comments by the advisory committee and the filing of those comments in the NPRM incubator proceeding.
All right, thank you. So you've moved that, Henry?
Yes.
And do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you.
We need editorial privileges, by the way.
Is there any discussion? Then I'd like to call the question. All in favor of supporting the recommendation made by the Broadcast Diversity and Development Working Group that we have in front of us today, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? All right, thank you very much. It appears we have the majority of the group, so we will support this recommendation and recommend it to the commission itself. And thank you very much for a lot of very hard work. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Is it fair to say that it was a unanimous vote as opposed to a majority vote?
Does anyone have any objection to that? Since I didn't hear any objections, then I
move unanimous consent.
That I think that's fair. We can let the record reflect that it was a unanimous support of the proposal. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you for that clarification, Jim. I'd like to take a small deviation from our agenda. Mark, who has comments for us, has to leave prior to his group being able to present their recommendations. And so we're going to ask him if he would make his comments now, and then we will come back and go back on our agenda for the day as it goes.
Okay, thank you very, very much, and thank you for agreeing to take me out of turn. And good morning. On behalf of the Diversity in Tech Working Group, I want to thank and acknowledge the members of the working group, many of whom are here with us today. We have Cindy, Marita, Brian, raise your hands, Bridget, Kathleen, Ron, I think is on the phone, Brooke, Claudia, Faith, Chris, Raquel, Monica, and Gavin. Raise your hands. All right, Tech Working Group. And I want to thank you for all of your efforts and all of your work. What I'll do is just give some opening comments, and later on in the meeting, Kathleen is going to flesh out the specifics of our recommendation. But this is what's important. In the tech sector, in executive leadership positions, 83% of those positions are held by whites, 10% by Asian Americans, 3.1% by Latinos and Hispanics, 1.9% for African Americans. If you compare the tech sector to all industries in the U.S., tech has a larger share of white workers, 68% to 63%, a larger share of Asian American workers, 14 versus 5, and other groups are less represented in the tech sector than the general economy of the United States. And our working group has identified that as one element, one very important element of the need for there to be more diversity in what we broadly understand as tech. Now, a couple of important challenges we believe we need to tackle, and one is there needs to be a clear definition of a tech company, because technology is so pervasive in American business today that focuses on what the core functions of the company are, not simply whether the company uses technology to facilitate those core functions. So we want to, if you will, suggest a definition, and then that will give us a clearer sense of who is a tech company. Secondly, while Tech Center diversity data is becoming increasingly available, there is very little qualitative data or information on diversity in tech. There are many reports out there, but there's no real baseline of data. And we think this is very important if we're going to credibly tackle this issue. And we think that if we're going to tackle this issue, we as a working group and the Federal Communications Commission can best, if you will, tackle this issue by creating an environment that encourages participation and cooperation. And our proposal will suggest ways in which this can be undertaken. We think this is a very crucial issue. It is as crucial as any issue in the American economy, because the tech sector is a growth sector and will continue to grow in the years that come. All we need look at the market capitalization of major tech companies in America today and understand the driving forces of this industry in American life. Our interdependency on them and our dependency on them, and the necessity for us to be on the side of creating greater opportunity in those sectors. I might add, and this is not part of the working group's working group's proposal, but we've also, in the work that we've done, looked at the tech sector and the diversity not only in its executive ranks, but the diversity on its governing boards, not only people of color, but also women. And there have been a few steps recently in that direction by some companies. And we also think that it is fair to look at the diversity of their philanthropic efforts, which is a really important part of what big companies do in this country today. So we want to thank all of the work, and I certainly want to thank Gavin Logan, who has been so important to keeping us all focused, organized, and together, for his tremendous participation. And hopefully you will be impressed with, and that our proposal, when you hear about it, will also earn a unanimous consent, because a precedent's been set today. The standard has been set. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mark, for your comments. I would like to ask the group if we can convene for lunch a little early. It's 10 after 11 now. We have lunch, which I want to thank T-Mobile again for your generosity and support for providing us with breakfast and lunch. So thank you very much to keep everyone's focus on the meeting, not on their stomachs. So thank you. The food is over there to the right on the table. We would ask that you would stay in this room for the working group that will be for whom the food is provided for you. I would ask you to be back here at 12:15. So we will start again at 12:15, and we'll then begin with Heather and your group's work and proposals. So we will come back again here at 12:15, and thank you all for your participation this morning, and I look forward to a good and continued discussion this afternoon. Thank you. Everything moving? Thank you again to T-Mobile. You have made the afternoon session much better. So you got us through the morning and also the afternoon. So we thank you very, very much for your support, and thank you. We're going to continue on in our agenda, and we're going to ask the Digital Empowerment and Inclusion Working Group. And Heather Gate, would you please share with us your organization and what your group has been doing?
Okay, my name is Heather Gate. I'm with Connected Nation. So thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, committee members, working group members, commission staff, and members of the public. On behalf of the Digital Empowerment and Inclusion Working Group, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to serve on this working group. During our inaugural meeting on September 27th, we were tasked with two critical objectives aligned with the committee's mission. Our PowerPoint presentation. There you go. Our first objective is to identify new approaches to expanding access to emerging technologies in underserved and underconnected communities. The second objective is to provide recommendations on ways to ensure disadvantaged communities are not denied a wide range of access to opportunities awarded by next generation networks. In pursuant of this objective, the committee assembled a wonderful group of thought leaders and subject matter experts who together have more than 100 years of experience championing causes for diverse communities across the country. They come from the telecommunications industry, nonprofit sector, research. They are from groups that champion for minorities, the LGBT community, low-income communities, women, children, and our workforce. More importantly, this group is committed to meeting the objectives that have been placed before us. Without further ado, I would like to welcome the members of the Digital Empowerment and Inclusion Working Group. So just raise your hand if I say your name. Is Susan Allen here yet? Susan Allen is with the U.S. Pan-Asian American Chamber of Commerce, and she may be joining us later. Laura Barakwal with Charter Communications. Rudy Brioche with Comcast NBC Universal. Donna Epps with Verizon. Hareen Contractor with SME. Anna Gomez with Wiley Rain Telecommunications Media and Technology Practice. I don't believe she's with us today. Elizabeth Lindsay with Biteback. Mario Lopez with Hispanic Leadership Fund. He just stepped out. Shelley Blackney is our alternate from T-Mobile. And representing Marie Celia Dixon from T-Mobile. Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee with Brookings Institute. Chris Wood with the LGBT Technology Partnerships and Institute. On the phone, I think we have Fatima Kothari. Are you with us? Fatima is with, what's that? Okay. Fatima is with San Francisco Bay Area Internet Society. And then we have two members that are not present due to previous engagements, and that is Janice Bryant Howard with Act One Group and Janelle Trigg with Lemon Center. Our working group meets on a bi-weekly basis. And as I stated before, we're committed to working together and offering recommendations to the FCC over the next 18 months. So in order to adequately address the challenges related to the digital divide, we thought it was important to approach our work along three critical spaces that encompass digital divide. That is access, adoption, and use. So accordingly, we formed three subgroups. The access or the deployment subgroup explores policies concerning deployment, availability of broadband networks and technologies to disadvantaged and underserved communities. While the deployment subgroup explores matters related to broadband networks, the adoption subgroup addresses the human aspect of the digital divide. That is working to help diverse communities overcome barriers to adopting new technologies. The use and digital readiness subgroup addresses the application aspect of the digital divide challenge for diverse communities. Are diverse communities ready to meaningfully adopt these technologies? And what are the implications of this use for the economy and quality of life? Now, Madam Chair and fellow committee members, I would like to invite Dr. Turner-Lee, our resident data expert, to talk a little about the status of the digital divide and to set stage for our subgroup reports that will follow. So, Nicole, would you like to take over?
Thank you. Thank you, Heather, and thank you to the esteemed members of this committee and to the members of my subgroup. Appreciate all of you. First, let me just pivot and just say before I go into this presentation that these opinions and the research that I present today are my own, and they're based on a body of research that is actually existing out there that most of you have read. But to avoid any type of questions around the data and data sources and interpretation, I want to put that out there. So let me speak a little bit about what Heather has sort of indicated has been the goal of our committee, which is what does it mean when we talk about the digital divide? And so our group has spent some time really encroaching upon in our subgroups how that gets sort of teased out in terms of policy recommendations. But before we get started, I think it's important for the committee to sort of get a general understanding of how the digital divide has been defined and how it has changed. So many of us know Larry Irving when he put on the table the concept of the digital divide, which at that time was representative of the haves and the have-nots. Who had internet access, who didn't have internet access, who had access to a device, who didn't have access to a device. And what I would actually argue, what Larry started has pretty much transformed itself given the emergent and disruptive use of technology. And so now the digital divide is quickly becoming something that is less binary and much more within the context of how we're seeing technology grow and evolve. And so as you see in the slide, this definition of constraint around binary definitions of it may also constrain the solution to the problem, which I think our committee also did quite well. I also want to put out there, it also makes it somewhat difficult when the data is somewhat outdated, which is one of the challenges that we all have. But I think we're going to get there in terms of coming to a more robust understanding of what digital access means. So today, the context of digital access for underserved groups is within that backdrop of automation and fast-moving innovation, and issues related to infrastructure, jobs, economic development, and 21st century service provision and delivery are critical elements of closing the digital divide. And again, that's something that our committee paid a lot of attention to, and it was some of the rationale for why we have those subgroups. Let me go to the next slide. And some of you may know this, but I want to just shock you today because I think it's important for you to see this. Here's what we know today. The number of internet users in the United States is increasing. For those of us, I have my glasses on. Pardon me if you can't see the slide clearly, but the slide to my left is basically indicating the trajectory from 2000 to 2018 and where we have seen internet access, which is at approximately 90%. So people are getting online. When I was at the Joint Center and we did the first National Minority Broadband Adoption Study, that number was much lower. Today, we're actually seeing that trend increase. And if you look at the slide to my right, that is by race. And so when you look at the numbers and the lines as they converge, particularly around 2016 to 2018, we're seeing more people of color actually engage the internet in different ways. And that's a good news story for a variety of reasons. Where the distribution becomes unequal, and Heather will go to the next slide, is when we start to look at particular demographic categories that have negative impacts when you look at internet usage. Older Americans, particularly those over the age of 50, the research has pretty much been settled on the fact that they are significantly lower than the rest of the population when it comes to internet access, and that would be the slide on the left. Right? So the older you are, the less likely you are to be online, which in and of itself sets up a quagmire, particularly for aging in place and other benefits that the committee will be looking at. If you look at the right side of it, when you look at income, the bottom line, and that's the line that should draw your attention, which is blue, are low-income people in this country that are not online. By income categories, those making under $30,000 have severely lower access and are stagnated in their adoption growth. For all of us, that should raise the alarm of concern. When we look at educational attainment as well as geographic residence, again, the slide on the left shows educational attainment, again, from 2000 to 2018. This is based on recent Pew data. High school is the blue line. So those with less than a high school education are, again, not showing some level of increase as a researcher, but now some levels where that is topping off and declining. So there's something happening there that we have to pay attention to. And obviously, most of us, if you look at the slide to the right, know, and that blue line represents rural communities. Rural communities and rural residents are less likely to take part in the digital economy. Now, without posturing my further interpretation of these findings, what I think this indicates for the diversity committee at large and our subcommittee specifically is that we have work to do when we still look at these numbers. When you compound race, age, education, rural residents. What that's basically indicating that an African American that lives below in the Black Belt or a Latino is less likely to be online. And that is something that should be cause for concern as we look at how to bridge the digital divide. Now, without being so pessimistic, there are opportunities that do exist within the digital ecosystem that I think are worth noting. I put this slide up from Harvard economist Kwang Wu, who talked about the higher level of ICT capita stock per capita in terms of allowing economy to be much more robust. All of us in this room would not disagree that having access to high-speed advanced information communications technology is certainly a driver for the economy. It creates spurts for social mobility. It allows us to be more efficient. And without having deference to one industry or another, what I did want to indicate, the rate of mobile data growth is obviously toppling. The last bar on the blue slide of 2019 shows an incremental leap in the amount of mobile data that will be available, thus suggesting the movement towards 5G technologies is probably properly situated. On the other side, cable is, interestingly enough, increasing and advancing their technical architecture. We're actually going to see faster cable speeds. Currently, the rate of upload and download through cable connections is as competitive, if not more competitive, in terms of what users are expecting in terms of content and access. So those internet and downloads and upload speeds are actually being very competitive on the wireline side. And obviously, I didn't have enough room on the slide to indicate the other technologies, but you all get my point, that there is something about the deployment of broadband that ties into the general ecosystem of where the digital universe is actually going. Given what I've laid out, however, with regards to what the demographic data does show us, the barriers to adoption do still exist. So it doesn't necessarily mean if you build it, they will come. Again, much of this is settled. This comes from Maureen Lewis at NTIA's report, Digitally Unconnected in the U.S., who's online and who's not. It's the lack of interest in getting connected, according to her report. 2001, it was 51%. 2015, which is where her data stopped for the ACS, was 55%. The cost of broadband service, which is interesting, it's actually gone down a point. It started in 2001 at 25%. In 2015, it went down to 24%. And the lack of access to a computer or a device, which still remains in single-digit numbers, but it's still one of those drivers that if you don't have it, it makes it much more difficult. These barriers, as I go to the last slide in just a moment, are really significant, I think, for the committee in terms of backdrop, the broader committee, because they facilitate further digital marginalization and they make people who are already on the margins of society further invisible within the context of an ecosystem that is supposed to help them solve problems versus alienate them. Which leads to the final slide that I will present in terms of backdrop for our committee. And again, a lot of these opinions are my own. You know, the digital economy has sort of shifted from this increased application and use of information to leverage to solve problems. So that's a little different. And I'm not going to age myself, although I probably will. When I was first in technology, we started out with this great software application called Encarta. We replaced the Encyclopedia Britannica for the Encarta CD, and my house was high cotton as a result of that. Everybody wanted to come by. Today, our young people have replaced that with new technology and the internet. And those use cases are actually driving this digital marginalization that I actually spoke of. So if you look at the vertical of education, as Commissioner Rosenworcel has said, 5 million households with children, school-age children, lack broadband access. That's a problem. When you look at workforce development, 78% of millennials now use the internet to find jobs. Just a few years ago with John Horgan's report, it was 50%. That number continues to increase, and baby boomers have now topped out over 57% when it comes to using the internet to find work. That's an opportunity. When you look at public safety, digital and solutions like digital policing, text to 911, improved emergency management communications are driving the effective use of the internet. And finally, social media. 66% of Americans in this country use social media to engage in civic or political activities. Just look at what happened this weekend. So all of that stuff compiled actually shows a use case for where the internet is actually moving again from a very binary, static community that has been driven by who's on and who's not, to something whereas people who remain disconnected will potentially suffer the consequence of digital exclusion in a way that automation and future innovations of AI and machine learning will further alienate them and place them at the margins of this digital conversation. So I'll leave it at that and pass it back to Heather, but I share that data because oftentimes we don't remind ourselves what the context and the construct for these digital problems have been and how they can be turned into opportunities for public policy to actually eradicate, eliminate, or reduce the impact to vulnerable populations, particularly those that are diverse.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you. Mic is off. Okay. Thank you again, Nicole. And just to echo what Nicole said, we have work to do, and we recognize the responsibility that we have as more new technologies continue to emerge all the year after year. So now that Nicole's helped us set the stage, I would like to begin our subgroup presentations. We're going to begin with the deployment subgroup, which is led by Rudy Birch. So, Rudy, can you kick us off?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Really appreciated and enjoyed Nicole's presentation because, like no one else, really lays out the issues before us. One of the good things is that at least here, sitting at the FCC, there's no place where we've talked about deployment issues more than the FCC. Indeed, the agency is charged with that specific responsibility. In terms of the relative resources that both the industry, civil society, academics have actually put into it, deployment has been one of the places where we in fact have been able to collect a great deal of information, and there's been many advances. But yet, despite these advances over the many years, it's just not enough because that digital divide that Nicole references still exists, and it's having its impact. So this has been a very robust subgroup. A lot of conversation, although I am the chair, along with my co-chair, Donna Epps from Verizon. This has been a working group where there's been no shortage of conversation, comments, and perspectives, which has been very healthy because we understand that these are very thorny and very difficult issues and very challenging issues. So deployment has been one of the spaces where we've had a lot of input. There is a lot that's been happening there. And the question is, how do we not necessarily repeat what has been done before? How do we not repeat what the FCC is currently reviewing as well? And how do we not compete with areas where, in fact, whether it's at Brookings or it's at other centers, where some of these issues are being tackled? So we felt that it was important first for us to lay out the many issues that are impacting deployment of broadband and various advanced technologies and see where we could actually add some type of value. And based on the actual layout of the people who were there, from Susan Allen, who wasn't here, Janelle, and others. You here? Great, fabulous, perfect timing. Perfect timing. It's been very helpful for us to get that cross range of perspectives for us to be able to come up with at least identifying what are the areas that we're going to tackle. So just the effort of getting into how are we going to add some type of value to what is already, which is already an area that's been quite discussed heavily, has been part of the significant effort we've put forth thus far. So let me at least highlight the areas that we've identified, the 3 areas that we've identified that we're going to focus in terms of the scope of the working group. The first work stream is to examine infrastructure policy barriers to nationwide deployment. This is the classic problem of how do you get broadband networks and advanced technologies to diverse communities. And we specifically say diverse communities because we're looking at the full range. Underserved communities, communities where not served at all, and the charge of the Diversity Committee is to ensure that we're closing that digital divide. And that digital divide is defined in many different ways, whether it's by class, it's by a race, or it's even by region. So we want to embrace it in a much more holistic sense, but yet at the same time, the specific work product itself is going to be quite specific because there's a lot to handle in this space of deployment. The second is examining opportunities for broadband deployment and participation in the digital economy. And this concept ties in with this view of digital equity. It's an area that we're actually going to dig in more deeply because we generally have a good understanding of where certain broadband services end and others begin and how you identify that gap. But equality is a much broader concept. Equality is a concept of broad distribution of resources, distribution of opportunity, distribution of benefits, and as a result, you have this misallocation of resources as well. How do we embrace that term in a much more holistic way in order for us to get beyond not just the digital divide itself, but to ensure that all communities, people have access, use, and are able to take the advantages of the digital economy in a similar way. And the very last is more specific than the prior two, and that is how do we help facilitate economic growth and entrepreneurial participation in the digital economy. And this is an area, again, where the FCC has a strong track record. It has the infrastructure in place for us to be able to reach out to certain entrepreneurs who may or may not have adequate access to these economic opportunities, and that where we can actually deliver a very concrete and very specific proposal. So that's the overall makeup of the subgroup. The issues themselves are broad. In many ways, they're overlapping. But we think that with focusing on specific key projects, we'll be able to at least provide value in each. But let's start with probably the biggest bucket, and this is a bucket where we add a lot of issues into it. So the actual work stream itself is one that is under formation, and that is the digital equities bucket. There, we're attempting to identify, to promote digital equity in deployment, availability of broadband network and technologies in the digital age. The first task is really to help us to define exactly what do we mean by digital equity. We're quite sure that Nicole will be able to write at least a master's thesis on the issue for us. But we're going to actually try to define it in a way that can really help advance the mission of the FCC. Because at the end of the day, we have to come up with recommendations that make sense for the commission itself. So that will be the first task that we take on, is helping to define it in a way in which we can hopefully, next steps as far as next iterations of this committee to at least look into further. But we help to the goal is to help to at least set the stage for that. What are the best opportunities to identify and to address the nature of the scope of systemic problems? What is, in this particular area, there are many examples, many anecdotes, but the focus of this group is to focus on what are the systemic problems, because we believe that by focusing on systemic problems, that's the area where the FCC and by extension this committee can provide maximum value. So our focus will be specifically on what are systemic problems as opposed to individual one-offs here and there. Another key question that this particular work stream is looking into is how do we examine and enhance various areas that are currently being reviewed. So the Lifeline program is a pretty hefty proceeding that the FCC is engaged in. Rather than jumping in and being part of the comments that were filed recently, instead, we're actually going to examine many of the key comments filed and see where are the areas where we could actually provide some value. Or even better, where can we take some of the ideas that are presented and offered in many of these comments and to see how those can relate to helping us address systemic problems that we identify. The Lifeline proceeding is just one of many others that are ongoing that we think that we could add or find some value from. So we'll be doing that over the course of the next couple of months. And the very last one is, what are the incentives that can be developed to deploy and deployed to enhance universal service? And there, we know that Congress is looking into many other proposals, one of which is the gigabit opportunity zones. And several others are certain concepts that we're going to review. Not to develop legislative proposals, but instead to look at these legislative proposals as documents that at least enshrine a certain set of ideas that have been commonly accepted. And once again, how do we pull good value out of that, or how can we add value to that through the commission and to advise the commission accordingly? So that's the first work stream, which is probably the biggest in Vegas and one that we're actually in the process of ongoing review. As we work through the next two, we get more specifics with some, and at the end we conclude with a specific recommendation to the committee. So next we'll turn to the second work stream, and that work stream is to remove barriers of deployment of broadband networks. That sits squarely in the area what Nicole was just talking about, so we'll turn back to Nicole to talk more about this particular work stream.
Thank you, Rudy. So I think Rudy has set up the first part of what this subgroup will be looking at, but obviously, as it was outlined in some of the data I shared, that the removal of barriers to deployment of networks is key. Our objectives here is to define, analyze, identify and analyze historic, systemic, and infrastructure policy barriers to universal nationwide deployment and the availability of broadband infrastructure and technologies to historically disadvantaged, underserved, and unserved communities. It's a powerful statement right there, but I think it's one that's necessary to sort of unpack for our committee what does that mean. Key questions that the committee has put front and center is, how should digital redlining be defined? We recognize in our committee that the argument in and of itself is not quite settled on even the definition of redlining looks like. And so we're going to take this as an opportunity to go deeper to provide some insight into what that conversation looks like, what is the current debate on that conversation, and if there's a systemic solution, we'll definitely explore that. What unique barriers to the deployment of broadband and other advanced communication services are experienced by historically disadvantaged, underserved, and unserved communities? This one takes the question of barrier to a more micro level and gets more granular to understand what our communities that are typically on this other side of the digital divide really experience when it comes to deployment. Many of us in this room have discussed it in our committee as well, and so we want to get at what those barriers may be and what the metrics may be for success. And then finally, given the FCC's work through the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, the BDAC, we hope to figure out the opportunities that exist that can supplement and amplify BDAC recommendations to address those unique barriers to infrastructure for historically disadvantaged, underserved, and unserved communities. So just a quick lesson on this. The Commission chartered the BDAC. The BDAC has been engaged in work for the last few months. Several recommendations have come before the Commission. Some have been voted on and approved. We feel in our committee that it is upon our representation in our subgroup and the committee at large to see which of those recommendations will have a particular effect on infrastructure within communities that are underserved. That will take it from the broad to allow us to come up with tailored solutions that fit for our constituent groups. We've started that conversation and we hope to complete it. And so in terms of addressing these three areas, we see this as a bottoms-up issue. We hope to meet with BDAC reps to get educated on what those recommendations and proposals are, ask questions in terms of their relevancy to the communities that we are concerned about, explore the opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses and enterprises within the BDAC recommendations, because some of the proposals will foster additional work and contracts, et cetera, and we'd like to be a part of it. We also hope to talk to a variety of stakeholders on the redlining issue and ensure that we have a work plan that encompasses the views from various stakeholders so that we can come up with a definition potentially. We're not sure we can do it in the 2-year appointment, but we're going to try to see what we could actually come up with in terms of a definitional fundamental understanding of the problem as well as the unique barriers to deployment. Thank you, Rudy.
And then our other work stream is being led by Donna and Susan.
Thanks, Rudy. Is this on? Okay. The third work stream really focuses on economic empowerment and making sure that we have diverse businesses engaged in and participating and frankly benefiting from the tremendous economic opportunities that broadband and technology more broadly are bringing to bear on our economy. There are a lot of different directions we could have gone with this because there are so many opportunities. Obviously, tech and broadband are disrupting almost every sector of the economy. But we decided to focus on procurement precisely because there is so much deployment of next generation networks that will take place over the next decade. As Commissioner Carr mentioned, experts estimate that $275 billion will be spent over the next 3 to 5 years on the rollout of 5G, and that's just one sector of next generation networks. So we decided to focus on how can we enhance and create opportunities for diverse businesses to participate, and not just deployment, but on a number of the sort of offshoots of the deployment, because clearly once next generation networks are deployed, there will be a multiplier effect, and a number of different economic opportunities will stem from those networks being available. So the primary proposal here is to put together a one-day supplier diversity workshop for small, minority-owned, women-owned, and other diverse businesses to help facilitate information sharing and networking about the various opportunities. First, obviously, we want to facilitate information sharing about the long-term and short-term private sector business opportunities that will be available. We also want to educate diverse suppliers about how to navigate corporate supplier diversity programs. And third, we want to enable networking between companies to increase their awareness about the nature of the opportunities, and frankly, just to do some introductions and some relationship building, because we all know that oftentimes opportunities arise because of relationships, and just being aware of the information that you need to plug into the business opportunities. So that's the primary workshop objective, but I'd say a secondary objective is for our subgroup to hear from the diverse suppliers themselves, to hear from the challenges that they face, to hear from some of the best practices, what works for them, what doesn't, so that we can raise awareness amongst private sector employers about what they can do to help address any obstacles or barriers that may exist for more diverse businesses becoming engaged in the workforce. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Susan to talk a little more granularly about this, but I do want to say that this is an area that the FCC's Office of Business Opportunities has been a leader in, and we hope to build on what's been really a terrific track record of facilitating engagement of diverse businesses in the economic aspects of the digital economy.
Thank you, Donna. I'm Susan L. Allen. Sorry I'm late. I got food poisoning last night, so I had to cleanse myself up with But I'm glad to be here. I've been looking forward to talking to you about this. I represent the Pan-Asian American business community in the country. Our organization is 33 years old this year. I'm the national president and CEO. We have an office in Washington, D.C. with full-time staff and 6 regional chapters that are located in the sweet spots or touch pain points of the Asian American business community. I'm very pleased to be here to be working in the trenches and work with the FCC in terms of how do the men and women in the neighborhoods in the forgotten areas benefit from this $275 billion worth of spending. Asian Americans have been very active in the technology area as well as the low-tech area, so I'm here to represent all of them. I may be a long dissent voice here in terms of whether the FCC is doing well with respect to reaching, empowering those who have not been served or underserved. And that is why I look forward to talking about this today. Under Dodd-Frank, the FCC is obligated to spend a certain amount of money in the small business community. 23 or 25% of its spend, of every agency spend, should be spent on the small business community. And out of that, 3% to the minority business community, 5% to women and all that. I just got those statistics from last year. Out of the 32 agencies, the FCC ranked the 25th on spending, number 8 from the bottom. And it doesn't even spend 1% of its expenditure on the underserved community. And I hope that my bringing this to your attention will create a more conscious effort from the FCC's commissioner to use it as a bully pulpit and advocate for greater and wider and deeper utilization of the small and minority business community. I am sitting at this working group here with those who represent the Asian, and I do represent the largest and most established Asian American organization in the country with 33 years of experience, and I am a full-time paid CEO. We have the LGBT here, with Hispanic here, with the African American here, and with women as well. So I'd like the FCC to take note of that. That said, I understand that supply diversity, which means the utilization of historically underused vendors, suppliers, the small businesses who aspire to work with the federal government, who spent $350 billion a year, and out of that, under Dodd-Frank, they should spend sufficient percentage of the spend in the community. And because the FCC work is so technical, a lot of the work that we talked about in deployment do not reach those who do not have the technical know-how. So therefore, in this working group, we talk about bring education to the next generation. But the time is now. We are spending money now. Don't always look to the future and say, tomorrow, next year. When a new employee comes to work with me and I said, I hire you, I pay you what you want, and you say your experience, deliver now, hit the ground running. But they begin to say next year, I hesitate. And so I hope that our approach to the FCC's work in terms of deployment and closing the digital divide would really look at the present. And how do you do that? You do that through economics, bringing real activities to the neighborhood so that they actually can benefit from it now. So I understand supply diversity was like a footnote before, and after I entered this working group, I kicked up some dust. I may not be the most popular person, but I would not be here. I should be fired if I do not speak out the way I do. And that is my legend in the future, and that is my mission here. I want to just supplement what Donna has so eloquently shared with you, that the objective of this working group is to improve small and diverse business participation. And I said small and diverse, not just diverse, because there are some diverse businesses like African American, Hispanic, Asian, who are large. They're well taken care of. Take care of the one below them. You got to take care, let the money dribble down. Small and diverse business participation and expand the opportunities to contract for information and communications technology sector associated with the deployment of the next generation networks and technologies. There is a lot of money to be spent with this internet world. The world is our oyster. Everybody's with all that technology. A small business could do it in the suburb, in the middle of nowhere, on the beach. So remember that. What they need is the door open to them. What they need is to be part of that network, the old boys and old girls network. What they need is connections. Who, when, what, where. They do not need how. They just need to be told when you need it, where do you need it, and who do they talk to. And some of my members, and supporters, not just Pan-Asian Americans, they are Hispanic, African American, LGBTs as well. They said, if you tell me that, I'll walk on my knees up the hill, because I know I could do that. Do we want to create opportunities for small and diverse businesses to network, to share information about business opportunities, who wants what, and best practices. Learn from other people's mistakes. Don't let them hit the head on the wall. Show them, because if they win, everybody wins. And for the corporate supplier executive, many folks in a corporation, they yell and they complain, they brag about how much they spend. You have to drill down on when the annual report. If they say they spend so many percent, so much money on small and minority businesses, make them hold accountable. If they stand in public and say we are the best company, published by this and this magazine, we get this award and that award, ask their CEO, would you stand by those numbers? Would you come to Congress, come to the commission and testify and say that we spend X number of dollars and we spend 10% of our annual expenditure on purchases on XYZ community? I bet they won't. And that's the truth. Only when we get them to hold them accountable, make them explain how do they come up with those numbers, then will we be able to really help the underserved community. So what is our recommendation? As Donna said, we're going to start, and I say start, this is just the beginning, with a one-day workshop where the Office of OSDBU, which is in the large agency, they call it OSDBU, Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization. That office will hold, the last time they held the public event, like what we're proposing to do later this year, a few years ago. Now you tell me the commission is doing a good job? No. They have not done a good job. They have got to be held accountable. So we're going to start with a one-day workshop where we're going to bring the corporations like Verizon, Comcast, all the other companies in and say, this is how you do business with us. Okay? These are our prime contractors, tier one contractors. I want you to meet them and you encourage the prime contractor to talk to the smaller ones. After having done that, because different companies have different nuances, different practices, then we, folks like us, the Chamber of Commerce, who actually are on the ground, digging the trenches. How funny, deployment, digging the trenches. Will come in and share our success stories, our challenges, our sweats and tears, and the problems we have trying to access, reach up, and try to get a piece of the American pie. And I think that this is just the only beginning, and I hope that we will not just stop with one small little event sometime this year to introduce the corporations who are in this marketplace, who are in a position to say, as a public policy, as a corporate responsible person, we will reach out and do better than what we have done. And then for the commissioners to truly use your position, your influence, and your knowledge, and your personal interest. You would not be here unless you're interested in doing what we are trying to do, to teach and preach and tell the country that the commission is in business. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy. And the deployment subgroup As you can see, we have more than 100 years of experience, and we are passionate about what we're talking about today. So, Madam Chair, that constitutes the end of the deployment group's presentation. We would like to open for comments and remarks before we offer our recommendation.
Certainly. Are there comments? Yes, Harun. Harun, excuse me.
No worries. To echo my esteemed colleagues' comments about communities and businesses getting left behind, when I was at USAC, they give out, let's say, $5 billion for every school and library across the country with broadband deployment. Has anyone in this room ever filled out one of those E-rate forms and how difficult it is? I got a master's degree, and I can't even fill out that form. I was there for a year and a half, and I did not understand a lot of this. And I think some of these structural, infrastructure delays or inhibits other communities from getting involved. So we've heard this from a lot of commissioners and previous chairmen in the past, simplifying the process to create a more inclusive environment. And that's something that we could definitely recommend to move forward, because there are a lot of Asian American, African American, LGBT small businesses that could be part of that pie to help drive economic growth in local areas, but they're not able to because it's controlled by a small consortium of consultants who understand, who wrote those rules and now manage those rules, and they're the only ones to be able to be the middle person from these schools to be able to get this funding to build out broadband, and that's unfair. I just want to echo her comments. We get a more inclusive environment.
Thank you. Other comments? Yes, Jim.
Thank you all. I really appreciated your comments about the opportunities in 5G. And I had a thought when I was listening, because oftentimes the small businesses and individuals who might be able to take advantage of these opportunities don't know anything about them. And it occurred to me as I looked around the room, and I've got Verizon, Comcast, T-Mobile, Charter, AT&T, I figured I should make this recommendation. Consider advertising information about these things on African American and other minority-owned businesses. I think there is a lack of information that filters down to the people who could actually step in, certainly in the employment side in particular, and certainly in the small business side as well. I think that's something that it obviously is not an activity for this committee, but individually you might want to discuss that within your companies about how to get that word out to the people who might take advantage of it.
One of the things that I think we are hearing around the table is for us to do a better job of communicating what are the opportunities to those people to whom we're trying to reach. So perhaps part of what we can be focusing on is how do we take the information that may exist and how do we get it shared to the people that need to hear it. We seem to have a gap there, if you will, between those that have the resources that are looking to spend them, getting the information to the people who are likely to be the ones that could step up and actually benefit from this. So I'm hearing that throughout some of these comments, and perhaps that's something we can look to. Certainly, Jim, that's what you were talking about with these particular companies and all the other companies that we might involve in something that perhaps the commission could be some sort of a gathering place for information, where we could then provide a single place where people could come to get that kind of information going forward, so that we can reach the people who have the opportunity to answer some of these RFPs that are out there, but just don't know how to get through the maze, if you will, to get that done. Yes, Donna.
Start to try to address that, to provide some information, but recognizing that the vast number of diverse businesses will not be in the room at our workshop. So part of what we hope comes out of this is an identification of key stakeholders that can also help us get the word out. And I think minority chambers of commerce have certainly been a valuable partner in doing that. But I think there are other stakeholders as well that have relationships. And I think I love Jim's suggestion too. You know, oftentimes there are ads about a product or service, and really utilizing all communications channels to get out information about opportunities, apprenticeships, for example, and how supplier diversity programs work. I do think that we have to rely on really a network approach to try to get the information out to the various folks that will benefit from it, because it really is a win-win situation when that happens.
Well, and I think what we're talking about is going to the places where the people who we're trying to reach frequent. So whether that's trade publications, that whether it's chambers of commerce, perhaps non-traditional places that might have been used in the past to try and reach those people and organizations and companies that have services to provide but might not know that the opportunity even exists to do it.
Agreed, but you got to show up, right? You don't show up, they don't get to meet the people. There's no connection there. So the businesses should have the opportunity to meet the big boys and the big girls and put them together. So I truly believe that the folks who are in a position to spend the money, okay, need to spend money in the community, not only to send them by an ad. That has not worked. It has been time memories. Putting an ad in a magazine has not worked. Nowadays, with nobody's printing things anymore. It's going to be going on social media. We got to find other ways to get them engaged, and we think to use all means, absolutely. But the community feels so forgotten, so left out. There are two worlds in procurement, in federal and commercial. I got public and commercial. They are so disconnected. Those who've made it are on top. Whether it's corporation, corporation get bigger, and even minority and diverse businesses, those get bigger. The left behind. Combined with contract bundling. You know about that? Contract consolidation. That has been a major problem for the federal government, and they now have debundled many contracts unless they have no other choice but to put all 10 contracts together, make it into a mega contract, and let it out for bid. Small business cannot take it. Even they are given that, they'll choke to death. They cannot. So a corporation do the same thing. They call it supply rationalization. Before they used to use 500 suppliers. Now they use 3. Well, how about the other 497? So there's got to be something that got to be done about it. I don't know what it is. Everybody has a pecuniary interest in making sure that they get better and better. But as a Chamber of Commerce, as folks who are in the nonprofit sector, we wear a different hat. Maybe we have a different heart. But the Commission has that heart here.
One of the things that I think we've learned through the BLT program over 18 years is the fact that most things get handled through relationships. And what we teach them in the class is you need to build the relationship before you actually have a business relationship with someone. You need to have a personal relationship with someone. You need to know who they are. They need to know who you are. So perhaps what we can focus on is helping these corporations and these organizations to start getting to know one another before the time when a contract is put out. Because that's how we've gotten 49 owners, if you will, out of the BLT program, is that they have relationships and have been building relationships before they actually needed to do business with someone. And that was how I bought my first station, was I already knew the bankers because of my previous employer. So I think your point is well taken, but we can be thinking about how do we start building those relationships with each other, inviting each other to each other's events and having panels and whatnot. When we invite someone in to come and speak to the BLT, they have a chance to meet the class, and then the class follows up with them if we train them properly. they are following up with them and getting to establish a relationship with them and looking for other opportunities to meet with them so that they have begun to establish that relationship. Because my experience has been that you do business with the people that you know. So if you don't know, you don't get to do business. So, Rudy, you had a comment.
Yeah, just to kind of add on to that, I very much agree with all the comments made. But one of the things we're trying to do is to really view this as how do we have an impact from a systemic perspective, because it's not about just a one touch and then problem solved or we just walk away. So the next phase of the working group is to really have a collaboration with OGBO to get a clear sense of what are the current infrastructure and systems they have in place. How can we enhance that? How can we view the fact is that we're not just looking at the various companies mentioned, because these companies in fact have programs in place. Communication is in fact necessary. How can OGBO be served as a vehicle that would actually provide some type of repeatable process where they can either help these firms communicate to the various vendors who are out there, or how do you actually increase the pie? Because oftentimes, particularly in the communication space, we focus on the Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, the T-Mobiles. But the fact is, it's a broader pie. And in fact, it's broader even beyond, it's a much larger pie. In fact, it's even broader beyond communications as well. The next working group is going to talk about technology. Mm-hmm. And I think that how do we actually access that as part of the supplier diversity discussion is probably going to be one of the more, I think, greater challenges. But at the same time, I think long-term would be one of the greatest benefits that if we could actually have a system where, in fact, we have a process through OGBO that invites both communication technology firms to be part of this process to help increase the pie, but yet at the same time to help increase or to develop systems that we can share in order to find a way to, in a more systematic basis to communicate opportunities that may exist in the private sector to the various vendors and others who may be able to take advantage of them.
Jamila, how do you think we might best work with OGBO? And given the fact that there is actually some new leadership, can you perhaps give us some background on where you see OGBO now and how these groups might work in a more proactive way with OGBO to see if we can't find ways to work together?
Sure. I think this is an excellent beginning of the conversation, and I think this particular working group is going to launch us maybe into the next phase of what OGBO can do and what OGBO can be for this particular community.
Does everyone know what we're talking about with OGBO? Sometimes we use all these initials.
Right. Office of Communications Business Opportunities. And so we're going to be putting OGBO together with the principals out of this working group, and they're going to start to build this one-day event. But I think, to Jim's point, what we're going to be looking for is for the people in this room to populate and pack the house on that day. So we're going to be looking for you all to talk to your constituent groups and make sure they're here. So if we're talking about broadcasters who need better access to advertising, we would expect on that day to see some sales managers, some general managers from minority-owned radio stations talking to these people about who do I need to see in your office so that you use me for advertising to reach particular communities. And that's an ongoing conversation. So those people need to be in the room. The LGBT groups, they need to be in this room on that day, making those relationships happen. And if what you're thinking about long-term is some sort of clearinghouse in OGBO to connect these people, then that's certainly a conversation that we can begin to happen if we can see a real fertile, organic sort of thing happen on that one-day event. I think OGBO would be willing to talk about that and how they put those groups together.
Well, and we, in the last diversity committee, the media issues subcommittee actually made recommendations of things to do with OGBO to create both educational plans. The commissioner referenced of the BLT program. We actually had been talking with ACBO about the possibility of creating some sort of a venue through the FCC. Because if everything we're talking about here really does seem like it flows through what ACBO has been designed to do.
That's right. And I would encourage these three working groups to kind of cross-fertilize and make sure that maybe there's a recommendation that will come out of all three groups about ACBO and new things that ACBO can do given the digital economy and the way things have changed.
Would it make sense I'm sorry. Please, go ahead, Kathleen.
There is one other piece of the puzzle to this that is difficult, but I think can be wrapped into this, and that is that, and having been in a company where I was very committed and a number of very senior people in the company were very committed to pursuing these relationships, we fought and encountered numerous hurdles internally with the procurement people. And that sounds crazy that you could be at such a high level and constantly get pushback. And so I think that as you're working through and you have this one-day meeting, it wouldn't hurt to get public statements from the leaders of the various companies, making it very clear that this is important to them, that they want to see numbers that reflect their willingness to have these kinds of procurements, even though, and this is the pushback I always got, even though it is less efficient than having a single provider for all of your widgets across the entire country. And I get that, but this is a different issue, and I worry that if we miss that messaging from on high, then in many companies you'll hit a brick wall regardless of how hard you push.
Just a quick pivot as a committee member just on that point. I think that's why we've also wrapped this ACBO convening around the unique barriers to deployment, right? Because there's now several opportunities that exist through the recommendations of BDAC and the acceleration of technology that make turning a blind eye no longer appropriate, because the opportunities are actually going to expand in all of these spaces. So I think that was really the intent, to have the workshop be one of those drivers that legitimizes the reason why this is even more necessary today.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Chris James. I'm with the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development. That's a long acronym, I know. I commend the working group. I think that's excellent. All the points that have been made, and the workshop is an excellent way to engage not only corporate, but I would also say federal government as well. I would make just a couple of suggestions. One, there's 68 SBA district offices around the country, so wherever you decide to put on the workshop, I would engage SBA. I would also engage the minority business, MBDA as well. And then for the actual business, for the invitees, I would suggest maybe a fact sheet or a webinar ahead of time before so they actually are prepared. Because one of the things that you don't want to do is have all the companies and all the OSDBUs and people that can make decision makers to the table, but yet they don't find the businesses that they're looking for. So therefore, a lot of times they're like, well, we tried it once, we're not going to do it again. So making sure that those businesses, when they show up to the table, that they have a capacity statement, that they're able to do the businesses, at least show that, hey, I do have the capacity to do this. And at least with my organization, I'm happy to promote and help and bring resources to the table. Thank you.
And I have a lot of experience with that. About 18 years ago, 1999, we launched the one-on-one business matchmaking meeting. And since then, it has become very popular all over the country. From the SBA took note of that and partnered with HP and American Express and made it bigger, but they can't do that because it's all the devil's in the details. You can do a very good, bring people, the corporation or government together, and folks come in and wait in line, but you do not match them they will go back home and say, we can't find anyone in the small and minority business community who can do what we do. So with us, what we do is, and I invite you all as my guest to my conference down the street in Bethesda in May, the end of May and beginning of June. We have an annual conference, 33rd anniversary. We have the one-on-one matchmaking meeting. The difficulty is you go to whether the government's Oxbow office or the corporation's supply diversity office. Most of the people who run that office, who work there, are outreach specialists. They don't do the buying. They are advocates. They got to go back inside and sell the idea to the buyers, the program managers in the federal government, and the end users in the private sector. So the folks who are in the front line sometimes have difficulty doing their job because they're just there going through the motion. I sometimes feel sorry for them because they're at the front and they got hit. What we have to do is empower those people with the ability, the status, to go inside and actually advocate for the business that, hey, you need to come to this conference because you are going to see the people who are anxious, who walk up the hill on their knees to come and see you and see what you want so they can learn about your business. And then if the internal buyers say, would not have this attitude, well, I've been doing business with this company, I like that, I don't want you to touch it. No, I don't want. Or I tried them once, they fail, I'll never use this ethnic group again. What we have to do is empower the frontline people with ability, with authority, and the endorsement from the top. Say, when I come to talk to you about this particular event, I think you ought to go. Don't just go there on that day. Tell me what you are buying in the next 18 to 24 months. Then I can go to organizations like USPAC and say, this is what we want. Do you have suppliers and business who fit in that? If you do, bring them to that meeting, and I will bring my managers, my program managers, my end users to come and meet them. Then they will not be able to go back and say, I tried it. It's not worth it because it's a waste of my time. I'd rather stay in the office, sit in my desk, and do my work. You see, go there and waste. I travel, I wasted my day, never work again. And that's the internal culture that we got to change. We've got to get the folks inside to buy into that and provide the top secret. What are you buying? When's the next time you need something? And then give it to the community like us so that we know, oh, so-and-so are going to have an opportunity to buy something new. They may have an incumbent, but every buying organization wants to get things at the best price, the best quality, the best after-sale customer service. And I think you can get that from the small and minority business community. So work internally. Just coming to the meeting is just going through the motion. It won't work. It would discourage both parties. The small business, I'm not going there because they give me a business card, I call, I email, they never return my phone call.
Well, the nice thing about the comments that we've heard today is I think they run a wide range of opportunity, Heather. I know that you and Nicole and Rudy and all of the committee have participated in this discussion, but I think we've had some good input in terms of making sure that the community itself is prepared for what they're going to find when they get there, getting to the right people in order to make the right people there, setting up relationships before we actually are asking for the orders, if you will. So it seems like there's a lot of great discussion that has come from around the table. So I thank all of you for your contributions to this. It's been a helpful discussion. Harim.
Sorry, just one last question, and then we can move on. I think language access is also very important in this issue. Whether it's languages that are traditionally Asian American, or having like offices like Oxbow. I'm not saying they do this, but not use Google Translate to do things in the Spanish language. I've had previous employers do that, and there's a huge mistranslation there. So language access is a pretty big, important way to reach underserved communities.
Excellent. Yes, Henry.
Yeah, I had a comment and a question. The comment is, previous advisory committees have had ideas about workshops, and in fact, those workshops have come off. But I will tell you that unless there's a follow-up mechanism embodied in the plan for the workshop, it doesn't work. So the workshop's the easy part. The follow-up and coming up with the infrastructure mechanism to facilitate continuing conversations is the hard part.
And being clear on what the goal is. I mean,
Yeah.
because we have previous, Henry's right. I mean, we have done this in the past. We have made recommendations, but it's that being the first step. Then what comes next? What is the goal? Yes.
LGBT tech. I think one of the areas I've previously worked with chambers, LGBT chambers specifically, and I think really making sure that they are at the table, whatever chamber it may be, representing those small business, small minority community businesses, and making sure they understand the process, because they are the ones that are going to be that resource for those small businesses. Living in a rural community myself, I'm telling you that the small those individuals that may be deploying or putting up the various communication towers or tools, they're not looking at this because they're trying to keep their business afloat. They're trying to keep it on a day-to-day basis. And so it really is on our chambers. It's on us to make sure that those chambers are educated on the process and making sure that we're advocating for them. And then it's those chambers' responsibilities to make sure that they are passing that information to their members. And I think that is the follow-up piece that is so important. Yes, you can hold a day meeting, but I think it's not necessarily here's the suppliers and here are the large companies or the medium-sized companies. It's here's the process. Here's the areas that we can really help you get to from point A to point B, and then it allow them to really help and drive their communities.
And making sure that people are prepared
Yeah.
when they come to that, so that they know how the game is played, which is really what we're talking about, and being prepared to be able to address that. Yes, Henry?
I have a question, and that is, I was struck by the potential overlap between what you're doing and the other advisory committee. And I guess my question is, I have two questions. One, are you concerned about that? And B, if so, what are you doing about it?
And that's the BDAC.
Yeah.
So in the interest, we have a couple other committees. If it would be okay, Madam Chair, Vice Chairwoman, if we can parking lot that question until we hear from the other two groups, and then we'll bring it back. Okay? All right, thank you.
All right.
Thing that I wanted to add to the group, I commend you. I really like the emphasis on procurement and supplier diversity. And actually, Donna Epps mentioned it during your presentation, and Commissioner Carr earlier mentioned apprenticeships as something that could be included within the umbrella of ownership, because the apprentice, just as the apprenticeships train for the jobs of the future, apprentices are the owners of the future as well. So just wanted to flag that.
Madam Chair. Go through the individual panels, but the last panel is going to include government officials like small business administrations to talk about certifications. I mean, what are some of the gating factors to get into business? But also folks from the Department of Labor to talk about apprenticeships. How do we make sure we have more diverse businesses in the pie? And I know we are out of time because we have two other groups to get to, so I will end that.
We'll come back to
We'll come back
Great.
to the questions.
Thank you.
We'll hold questions till the end.
But I just want to say, this is the kind of conversation I think we need to be having. It's important to hear what the groups are saying, but I also think this kind of feedback is what gets us to fine-honing what we're doing to making it really effective. So thank you all for your comments. This has been, I think, a healthy conversation, and we look forward to hearing the rest of your presentation.
Yes.
So, yes.
Thank you, Rudy, and the subgroup, the deployment subgroup. Given that presentation, we would like to recommend that the committee support and convening a supply diversity workshop here at the FCC headquarters in conjunction with FCC's Office of Communications, Business Opportunities, and the Media Bureau. The rest of the recommendation is in the folder if you would like to.
You all have that recommendation, if your folder, if you would take that out. Okay. Thank you. Are you moving that, Heather?
Yes.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Thank you. Discussion? Not that we haven't had a little discussion already, but if not, I'm going to call the question.
Apologies.
Yes, Hareem.
Further discussion, but to Henry's point, should we not discuss, I know later in the parking lot, whether this is redundant to the BDAC commencing or something the same, before we recommend moving on?
This is the supplier diversity
program. I take it back.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Charter. Can you all hear me? Is it?
Yep.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, just as a follow-up to the last piece of our proposal, and I'm part of the working group, and as I'm hearing the conversation, particularly Henry's points on that one-on-one consultations, I think it would be good to also consider the prospect of having the panelists that will be on that first panel, all of the companies, to have one-on-one sessions that are not necessarily one person, but rather each company can host a table for a set amount of time, which enables more people to be able to come to the table, hear what each company has to say, and it broadens the opportunity to find a match for that company, which improves our follow-up. At least, I can speak for Charter, our follow-up with those individuals to say, okay, well, they might be good for this business unit, they might be good for that business unit, but it also facilitates the networking opportunity between suppliers, because I think that's really important. So I just wanted to add that caveat and recommendation so that we are, if we decide to change that one-on-one to more of a, company-by-company presentation, that's something that would be permissible.
And are you suggesting an amendment to this proposal, or simply information to the working group?
Information to the working group as a consideration as we move forward and finalize our plan.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
So obviously, all this information has been great. One thing we are going to do is we are scheduling and have meetings with ACPO. So what we'll do is, through the chair, we'll inform the entire committee to the extent you have an interest, you'd like to weigh in. We'll make sure it's inclusive. So it's beyond just this particular working group. It's also the other working groups as well, so we can get the good input.
That would be
All right.
that would be helpful, I think, especially because there may be, frankly, overlap between all three of the working groups in terms of how this might apply, or if this is a successful program, the other groups may find that that's something they would want to consider also. So I think that makes a good point.
Yeah.
All right. Any further discussion before I call the question? All in favor of the motion as presented? Aye. Opposed? The motion has unanimously.
Thank you.
I have a learning curve, Jim. Thank you. The motion has unanimously passed. I thank you very much. And I have been able, it's been my privilege to listen in on many of this group's activities. And I can say that what I love about this group is that they are a diverse group of individuals who all have had strong opinions. And what comes out of it, I think, is really a very well thought out and healthy discussion of what we need to do to make it work. So it's been great. And thank you. Thank you, Heather. And thank you to all of you. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I would like to go ahead and introduce the next subgroup.
Yes.
That is the adoption subgroup led by Fatima Kathari, who's participating via phone. But in terms of the presentation, I would like to introduce Chris Hood, who's a subgroup member, who will be leading that presentation. So, welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everyone, and thanks. It has been a very lively conversation on a lot of these subgroups, and I had the opportunity to serve on a couple of them. My name is Christopher Wood. I'm the Executive Director of the LGBT Technology Institute and Partnership and Institute, representing the LGBT community around technology from a nationwide perspective. We really focus a lot of our efforts on research and understanding the impacts of technology on the LGBT community and within the LGBT community, and how we might implement those in both policy and programs. I want to, coming off the deployment subcommittee, we're talking about now adoption. So once it's out there, how is it being adopted? And I think this is a crucial point, one that we've seen in the LGBT community and the work that we've done, but also I know many of the panelists or many of the subgroup members also have been working on this for a very long time, and it's been a topic of conversation for a very long time. And that, to Nicole's point, it is not a binary conversation anymore, and that it really spans all kinds of different areas, including race, age, location, among other factors. With that, I'd like to talk about some of the objectives that have been set out for us. And really, I think one of the biggest things that comes to mind here that Heather talked about, and so did Nicole, is the human element. And the adoption of technology is a very human thing, and technology in creating the human element in creating that technology. And we could go into all kinds of different areas, but I think one thing that we really need to understand is we need to meet the communities where they are. We need to meet the individuals where they are. Reviewing existing strategies for measuring both broadband adoption and the related barriers with those, like affordability, lack of awareness, relevancy. As we talk about those who may have gone through most of their life without using technology or a computer, very familiar with walking to the post office or going to the local government office to get the things done, is very different from what my 4-year-old does nowadays, where they would rather look at a screen than look at you. So I think really trying to understand, and in a lot of the conversations we've been having, really understand what is the adoption barrier? Does it matter? Is it relevant? Also, identifying new approaches to expanding digital equality in underserved and underconnected communities. I think we've talked about this in various approaches. For LGBT communities specifically, I think one of the common misconceptions is that a lot of LGBT communities are well off and economically stable, when in fact that's true for individuals that look like me, white, gay male, but not for anyone that looks anything but me. And so I think it's very important to understand where people are digitally divided, where they do not have access, where they have no access to a cell phone or a computer, and really understanding what the connections are in both urban and rural. And so, again, going back to those important issues of what is digital equality and what does that look like across the country, not just in our urban centers. And build on recommendations using human-centered design approach and address the broadband discussion from an empathetic viewpoint. Nothing has given me more empathy than being and working in the foster care system as a foster father. And I think it also reminds us every day that there are individuals across this country that have never picked up a cell phone, that have never had the opportunity or the luxury to connect. And so we really have to think about it from those human elements and those sheer possibilities that are out there and exist. And we need to make sure that we're addressing those in an approach that is empathetic to all situations and being able to bring those as recommendations. So I'd like to kind of go into the recommendations piece, or our work plan, and the way that we are really looking at doing this. We're really looking to, over the next several quarters, engage with representatives from communities on digital inclusion initiatives. I know from the experts on the panel, like Nicole, to many of the other experts across with various recommendations, but at a city, state, and federal level. So understanding not only what's going on at across the United States, but also at a state and city level, like areas like West Virginia, where I have a home, where a community college can have one county that is completely connected with fiber and 5 others that are not. Reviewing current policies in place to help underserved and vulnerable communities overcome barriers to adoption. Things like Lifeline, as was brought up in in the other subgroup, E-rate, private programs, and other nonprofit initiatives, because we can't do this from a national perspective. Not one organization can take it on. I think there's opportunities for organizations to dive in there, but we need to make sure that not only do companies understand what the problems are, but the nonprofits understand what the problems are as well and how they can have a serious impact. I would like to highlight our Power On program, which now has, as of tomorrow, will have 8 centers across the country with access to over 7,000 homeless or at-risk LGBT youth, putting devices in their hands and connections. And that can be duplicated, and we're building that program so it can be duplicated across other minority communities. Also, inviting speakers and facilitating community engagement with the FCC's chair's office. So other nonprofits that may not necessarily have a seat at this table, may not necessarily have a voice here, but making sure that we're engaging individuals from all communities. I think one of the biggest things that I continuously recommend is that we don't treat every one of our centers or every center. I'm quite sure you would not treat one of your various regions in any particular way, because each region, each city has a different need. Each city has a different need, and so we want to make sure that we're inviting speakers and facilitating engagement from members who understand not only what's going on in their community, and we can begin to figure out the overlaps so that we can really make progress and change here. And out of all of this, develop a report highlighting success stories and expanding broadband adoption in underserved and underconnected communities. I think I would have to thank some of my best mentors. One of them being Jameis Shelton, who actually ran the True Colors Fund, or Cyndi Lauper's organization in New York. She kept telling me, you need to tell your story, and those stories are extremely important. Telling the story of how a program worked and how it was successful allows us to build upon, or allows other people to spur the ideas of being able to be successful in their own communities. Although it may not be adapted completely, a complete copy, it may be an opportunity for them to see a new way, a new perspective, and a new approach. I think this is a very, I just want to close with this. Nicole outlined some barriers to adoption, a lack of interest, and that may be for some of our older generations or those that just don't have an interest at all. But two of them being cost and a lack of access. And I think those are areas that we can really help. We have a huge obligation not only to minority communities, but rural communities and communities where individuals can really make a difference. Thinking about the people I've met along the way, people who are from rural West Virginia who now have worked at some of the largest companies in the world, Facebook, Google, and had the opportunity to travel the world where otherwise they may have not thought they would have. And it was all because of connection. It was all because of access. So I'll leave it with that, and I'll turn it back to the chair. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like for us to hold the questions until the last subgroup has presented. But just to reiterate some of what Chris said, I think it's very important for us to recognize, particularly with the lack of interest. One of the things that I've, in my 10 to 15 years in being involved in adoption programming, is that there's nuances to that lack of interest, and it's lack of information, communication, and knowing the power of the internet, or knowing what you can do when you have access to the internet. In training, I have had the opportunity to provide digital literacy training in an urban environment in Appalachia and in a tribal community, and it's very interesting. One thing that they all had in common was that they did not understand why they should, and after learning about their interests and showing them the power of, for example, if you're an artist, you can use social media to promote your own art, then it becomes relevant to them, then it becomes of interest. So it's really so much more of a lack of understanding of the power of the internet. And it's also, for us as a community and a society, it's a loss of potential. Entrepreneurship, economic opportunity, and improving a value of life if we don't translate that lack of interest to people who are more aware of the power of the internet. So, anyway, thank you, Chris. I would like to go ahead and move on to the Youth and Digital Readiness subgroup. The lead for that group is Janice Bryant-Hoyt, and she's not with us today. So, presenting on behalf of that subgroup is Hareen Contractor. Hareen, would you like to present for us?
Yes, ma'am. And I want to say thank you, Madam Chair. You've done a terrific job of herding a lot of our sheep, making us stay on task. Our subgroup was very passionate. We had a lot of very vibrant discussions. This is a very broad topic, and it took some work, but I think we laid the foundation of a few pillars that we can start building off of to start moving this forward and start talking not only about broad things we agree on, but getting to soup to nuts and start moving the needle. So the basic objective of our subgroup was provide recommendations on ways to ensure disadvantaged communities are not denied a wide range of access to opportunities and get awarded the next and be part of the next generation networks. And whether it's through education, economic, public safety, civic opportunities, these are all important. And some of these things overlap to interact with each other. And that's some of the discussion we were having, what we're going to get into a little bit here. So we tried to define our scope into these 4 major buckets. And Nicole did a really good job of providing numbers to these important pillars, because this is some of the foundation of digital readiness and adoption that we talked about here, is trying to eliminate that homework gap. There are so many students right now that lack broadband at home or basic access to internet. I don't know how in today's world you could go home without looking on the internet for support or to do your own homework. Yet that's happening. There's about 6 million kids that don't have access to broadband at home or even at school. And Nicole can tell you a lot about this, but inequality is exacerbated after kindergarten. A lot of students, that are pretty much equal to that point, at early childhood education starts deviating from that point and exacerbates inequality. So we need to start addressing that early on. Public safety. There's a huge need to make sure disaster response doesn't depend on your skin color, your location, your anything like that, or your income. If there's a disaster coming, then the response and readiness needs to be there, regardless of where you live and how you look. And civic engagement. A lot of the ways you start interacting now with your local communities and your local representatives, either through Facebook, through Twitter, through local apps, to be able to say, hey, there's a pothole down my street. But if you're not able to do that, or if your government is not digitally active to be able to get those things, it takes a lot longer for you to get address things that you need. One of the things that the chairman was really great about when he was a commissioner was start getting on Twitter and start interacting with people and start talking about the digital divide conversation through Twitter. And he was able to facilitate some of these conversations before that they didn't feel like they had a seat at the table. And so that's one way we can really drive adoption and drive digital readiness. And workforce development, a lot of these things tie in together. The exacerbation of inequality starts early on, and that affects worker readiness later on. There's so many people right now that are not able to join the workforce or to be able to get some of the skills that they need to do the current jobs because they're not digitally able to address these things. Upskilling is pretty key. I had people I went to college with that were art history majors, and they lost their jobs during the major recession. And they're like, what am I going to do? When they went to a General Assembly course for 6 months, and now they're able to get a data science job that gave them a $100,000 pay boost, and they have unlimited access to employment opportunities now. But because they had the resource to do that, they were able to get to that course. But there are a lot of people that do not have access or the resource to even take something like that. I think we talked a lot about this in our subgroup, but there needs to be a lot of upskilling that needs to happen. We've seen a lot of evaporation of on-the-job training from companies, and we've also seen a lack of credentials and ability for people to get into these jobs. And so talking about that and how can we be more inclusive, provide an avenue for underserved communities to be able to take advantage of the digital economy. So some of the things we want to talk about over the next year, to the next slide here, is acknowledge and review the role that digital economy plays, not only on child education, but workforce development, economic development, civic engagement, and disaster response. We want to be able to be more concrete with some of our recommendations instead of just providing recommendations that go in the air and collects dust and people forget about it. We want to identify metrics so we can monitor and track progress on engagement and readiness, so we could start talk about these success stories that Chris mentioned. Otherwise, they're just, again, recommendations that gather dust. And again, been a broken record on this, but we want to make recommendations that actually move the needle and leverage and align existing resources. A lot of the recommendations we talk about, we don't actually need additional funding to do because they're being done right now. It's just not aligned. People are not rowing the same boat in the same direction. When we talk about worker readiness, there's career one-stop job centers and apprenticeship programs in local areas supported by the Department of Labor, but people don't know they could go to their local library to be able to get that access to that information. They don't know that their local library hasn't applied for an E-rate grant to get broadband so they could start getting this on-the-job training. A lot of these resources are there. It's aligning that and making people aware and making people vocal. And again, provide recommendations for the FCC to act as a bully pulpit so they could provide platforms so everyone gets on the same page and start rowing the same way. So that's briefly what we talked about. I look forward to the discussion, and thank you for everyone for being a part. I know this is the last group before we have a coffee break. So thank you for everyone for staying attentive and listening into this great work we've done.
Yeah. So with the use category, for some of us, speaking as somebody in the nonprofit sector, and Nicole, use is where success is realized. That's why we do what we do. We want people to have the foundation, which is the networks. We want people to have the skills, which is adoption. And then use is what at the very end, we want people to be able to find jobs online. We want people to we want children to have access to educational materials. And we want the economy, we want communities to do well. We want improved quality of life in historically disadvantaged communities. So while some of the talking points may be outside the purview of the FCC, we think it's important for the Commission's bully pulpit to recognize what that success looks like. However, some of those line items under use are strategically selected, particularly public safety with regards to disaster response. We recognize the FCC's current role with the disasters that we've gone through in the past year. So there'll be some policy considerations as well.
I just wanted to add, as a member of this subgroup, just two nuances for the general committee to sort of grasp onto. The first is we intentionally place an adoption category by itself and a use category by itself. And that ties specifically, it's a little break in what has been settled around how we look at this issue, but adoption tends to be more on this whole concept of, are we getting it, once you have the infrastructure, are people attaching to adopting the broadband, subscribing to it, using the access or understanding the relevance of the access. Whereas use, and I would ask this committee to sort of think of it this way, is the agency of broadband. Where are there cases, and the cases that we picked, where we think we could see the biggest impact among underserved and historically disadvantaged communities? And again, that's workforce, education, et cetera. So just something to think about. It's a concept of, the concept of agency has not been specifically explored by the FCC and this committee in the past, having served on previous terms. And going deeper into the scope of that agency, how are people using broadband to improve quality of life, to better engage with verticals that improve quality of life, is really at the heart, I think, of the presentation of our last subcommittee.
Okay, that constitutes the end of our subgroup presentations. And now I would like to open for questions, and I think it would be great for us to start off by responding to Henry's question.
So, Henry, I'll respond to that, having been one of the committee members that served double duty between BDAC. I think the recommendations, proposals that came out of BDAC that are publicly listed and available really are around some of the challenges in terms of streamlining and citing practices that will potentially slow down the evolution and acceleration of new technologies, advanced technologies. So in our case, what was not discussed in BDAC is the implications for minority supplier procurement opportunities, supply diversity, et cetera. And so this is a great opportunity because the BDAC was specifically charged with the nuts and bolts of infrastructure, and we're specifically charged with the nuts and bolts of diversity. And so we see it more complementary and the ability to amplify, if not enrich. And we did receive positive feedback from the BDAC leaders that did participate on a call with us, where they had not had that question posed to them. And several members from the civil rights, social justice, and research communities were represented throughout those committees. And I can say, and I say this because you all know what I feel about civil rights and diversity, it wasn't an intentional excuse for not discussing it. It wasn't just the purpose and the nature of that committee to go into the weeds on that. And so we feel it's an opportunity, and it is sort of what Susan was talking about. It's not just an opportunity, but it's our obligation to figure out ways where that committee can be enhanced by the work of this committee. Something that we, for those of us that sat on this committee, we wanted to do more of. And because these advisory committees are very active and they're proactive, we want to be on the right side of history to ensure that the implications that it has for growth and opportunity for communities of color are answered, as well as the implication opportunities for any kind of negative impact. So yeah, we see it as a process that is not necessarily going to overstep the other, but it will amplify.
Compatible.
That's right. That's right. And it will align. And if done correctly, which we think we can do, we'll be able to potentially come out with some deliverables that sort of align those areas that come out of the BDAC that would be amplified exactly by the participation of diverse communities.
And just to connect it back to our supplier diversity discussion, it's reduction in regulations and whatnot that BDAC proposes. Does that create opportunities? And can we be a vehicle to make sure that those opportunities are communicated to diverse communities, whether via the workshop or any other opportunities that come after that?
It's a great question, Henry, and a great response. I think that helps see how those two can actually fit together, and that sum being greater than the parts of it. It's a more complete way of looking at the question and hopefully some answers. So thank you. Are there other questions, comments, anything that you would like to put to this group, which has clearly been active and busy and working on all kinds of great things to bring to us? Yes, Henry, please.
Other diversity committees, advisory committees, have put on a supplier and procurement workshop. And I'm just thinking that they're in conjunction with OCPO. So there may be records that you might want to try to find or avail yourself of, and there could have been some recommendations that came out of such an effort that might be instructive to your effort.
Yes. Our next step currently is to meet with OCPO and gather that intel and take it from there.
You know, Henry, I would say indeed, I think there are at least, at a minimum, two great minds sitting in one corner of this table here who could actually help us as well. So.
Yeah. We've perhaps been down this road.
Exactly.
Yeah, we have. Thank you, Henry. Other questions, comments? Thank you. That was a really illustrative report, and I think you all have done a great job. So thank you so very much for all your hard work and all the hard work we've set you out to do going forward. So thank you. Thank you. And now I'd like to move to our Diversity and Tech Working Group. We all were able to hear Mark's presentation this morning, and thank him for that. And now Gavin and Kathleen, if you two would lead us down the rest of the work of your group, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, and we also appreciate the distinct honor of being the last thing between you all and adjournment. But we will be succinct.
You will keep us scintillated.
We will. So, as you heard Mark Morial, the chair of the working group, he set the framework and the backdrop behind why this working group in particular is important. And it's actually quite fortunate that we are the last of the group, because it's, in a lot of ways, it's the culmination of the work that you all are doing in your prospective working groups, meaning that once you have created these avenues, how do we make sure that there's full inclusion in the tech ecosystem, and particularly the tech industry? To put it bluntly, diversity and inclusion is not just a business imperative, but it is an American imperative to ensure that we continue to grow together as a nation. So, and I think that is at the heart of what's driving all of us, to make sure that we are all fully included and represented. So, from our perspective, we are addressing it through first holding tech roundtables and ultimately providing what are essentially best practices for incorporating and implementing diversity and inclusion. Kathleen Abernathy will do the honors of discussing the tech roundtables in detail, and then it will come back to me to discuss the timeline as well as who we think will fit into our definition of the tech industry. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you. And I'll talk fast because I know we are getting to the end of the day. One of the big challenges we had, and it was pointed out early on in the process, is that the scope of the FCC's jurisdiction over technology companies is somewhat limited. And yet, they have a huge impact on our society, on our economy, on our hiring. They reach out and touch everyone's lives. And so the question is, how do we wrap our arms around this group and really try to move forward on diversity and inclusion hiring? We had a great group together. I can't thank Gavin enough for juggling multiple balls and keeping us on track. The other person that was really instrumental in this but ultimately ended up having to step down from our group was Linda Spradley Dunn, who's the CEO of Odyssey Media. Because as we started talking about how do we gather and get information, she pointed out that a lot has been tried, some has worked, some has failed. And we don't want to reinvent the wheel at this stage. So our thought was, all right, let's go to them. Let's go and have a workshop and organize roundtables with members of the tech community. And originally we thought about having folks all together in a room, but there's lots of good and sound legal reasons why we cannot do that as a single group. And in some respects, as we rethought our proposal, the idea of having senior people come in one or two at a time is probably better because I think we'll have a better conversation. It will make for a couple of long days in the sense that we would go out to California using maybe university facilities, have everything tightly scheduled in advance where we'll invite the senior people in to say, okay, what, if anything, are you doing? And if you're doing nothing, just tell us. Fair enough. Don't waste your time. Don't waste our time. If you've tried a couple things, tell us what was effective, what wasn't effective, lessons learned, where you're going from here. The goal is that this is a way to encourage them to participate with us, even though there is a lack of jurisdictional oversight that would necessarily force them into the room. But I think there is, I suspect that a lot of them have actually been thinking about this. It's an important conversation, an important topic, and I suspect that there have been some steps forward, probably some steps backward. We need to know what that information is. Right now, we don't have that information. So not unlike what I think Chris discussed as far as going out and engaging with the players that are making a lot of these decisions, we want to go out and engage with these folks out there, talk about diversity and inclusion initiatives, gather the data and the information together, create some best practices, probably supplemented with a lot of what's going to be going on in other areas of this advisory committee, and then end up with a product that can then be used to inform and hopefully continue to push for improved diversity and inclusion policies all across the tech sector. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing. But then the question became, well, everyone's a tech company. How many are you going to meet with 200 companies? And no, we're not. But we want to make sure that we identified the key ones that are most likely to have an impact. And for that, I'm going to turn to Gavin and let him chat a little bit about how we tried to figure all of this out. And to the extent that we host this, and we're planning on hosting it in later on this year, maybe we roll in some, if we're going to have these things, maybe we roll in some other dialogue too. We're always open to modifications and adjustments based on everything we heard here today so that we're not duplicating efforts. But I think the goal, again, is to actually create some sort of document with useful information that we pretty much push out to the tech industry and say, look, there's stuff that works and you're not doing it, and here's here's what you can do.
So, as far as the timetable, we will begin hosting the roundtables during the rest of 2018. And through the first quarter of 2019 up through the third quarter of 2019, which is at the end of the charter for this committee, we will work on and ultimately produce that best practices guide. Now, for the big one as to who would be invited to these roundtables, we first had to decide what is a tech company, because frankly, in a lot of ways, tech company has been the cool catch thing to be. So you have a lot of companies claiming tech company that we might not necessarily be focused on for the purposes of this event. So we define the tech company more by the core functions and not its simple use of technology to supplement those core functions. And what we came to is, and I'll read directly, is a tech company and industry is comprised of companies engaged in the design, development, support and or deployment of computer, information, and communication systems, applications, or services. These include industries associated with information distribution technologies, such as television, telephone, and the internet, and companies providing e-commerce, cloud computing, social media, search, and online advertising services. So even though we've narrowed the scope, we were able to still make it comprehensive enough because we understood that this industry is wide-ranging in what it does, the fields that it plays in. One of the things we looked at it in terms of trying to make sure that we had enough companies to fit within that definition, we looked initially to, frankly, Forbes, because we knew that in order for this to maximize impact, we needed some of the larger companies, those companies that have a lot of clout behind them to buy in. And so they would need to be invited. So we simply looked at Forbes' top 25 tech companies and found those companies that met our definition. So some examples for the record are Apple, Samsung, Google, IBM, Intel, to name a few.
And all of you, these are listed in the sheet that's in your packet, so if you want to be able to follow along with Gavin as he's speaking.
Yeah. And we also did acknowledge that we would, in order for this to be the most robust and most impactful and informative, we would need to look at some smaller companies too. So we will be inviting some of those companies with smaller market share and, frankly, small businesses as well, small business startup tech companies as well. So that is our proposal in its entirety. We're open to questions, comments, and move from there.
And we have a recommendation.
Oh, yes.
One thing I would ask is, have you considered talking to the private equity companies that in many cases are the ones that invest in these companies, the Ubers of the world and whatnot, that are looking at private equity? If you can get the private equity companies to be concerned about those companies in whom they invest, then I think it gets the attention of those companies to be much more concerned about it. The CEO of BlackRock, which many of you know is a major private equity investor out of New York, the CEO, Larry Fink, did a open letter to CEOs in January where he talked about the fact they were only going to be investing in those companies that had concern for all of their stakeholders. They were only going to be investing in those companies that had purpose and could articulate that purpose and that were concerned about the ecosystem in which they did business. That is a pretty huge statement from one of the country's largest private equity investors. So I think that looking at private equity in terms of this also would be an important piece.
You know, they'd be the East Coast meeting. If you look, there's a West Coast and then an East Coast more or less. But I think private equity will be important. We'll have to figure out how to incorporate. The roundtables are what are you doing now and how are you doing it. I think the private equity, it's a different conversation. And you're right. they could supplement what we're trying to do with the tech companies, but it will be a slightly different conversation, because the conversation will be, and by the way, we need you to agree that, although I guess Apple doesn't need their money anymore, but for future companies, that this will be an important factor.
And Silicon Valley has a ton of these. That's
Right.
where most of them actually are.
Okay.
BlackRock does all kinds of companies.
I guess
but
we
there
have
is,
to do 2 different days. And that's okay, because once we're out there.
Well, the other side of this is when you start to publicize those that are the most successful rather than the carrot and the stick, forget the stick and focus on the carrot. If you start to publicize those companies with their best practices and they become, kind of the poster children, the investors like to invest in those companies that are doing well. So it's just something to think about, because you want to get them to care. Their investor money will be what will help them care about what they're doing. Yeah.
Laura
Yes.
Barraquer with Charter. I think that's a great point, and I think the other piece that you all could consider is when you highlight some of the smaller tech companies, and you're also addressing the private equity issue that Diane just brought up, it also creates an opportunity to showcase successful smaller tech companies that these private equity companies can actually invest in. So you're creating a network where you're not only looking at these larger companies, but you're also considering how can we help support some of these smaller minority tech companies and get them some funding as well.
Yes, Harim.
Pardon me, a couple of points. Great work to your team. I was a part of the My Brother's Keeper conversations in the Obama administration, along with Secretary Tom Perez, and we got a lot of these companies at the table to talk about what we can do to get, disadvantaged communities into these rising industries. We heard a couple of things over and over that we didn't think were that you might hear in your conversations were, well, a lot of these communities don't have the skills that we're looking for, right? And so, if you help us invest in these skills, then we can start hiring these folks. Some of it is, well, one, they're not actually investing in on-the-job training to develop these skills. Two, since those conversations, they've done a really good job of investing in groups like Black Girls Who Code or Girls Who Code to help bridge some of this divide. That's great, but I think a lot of it part of it is a supply and demand disconnect that exacerbates inequality here. Some of it is purposely limiting the supply of people who can actually do some of these jobs by saying, oh, you have to have a college degree or a master's degree for things that you probably just could have an apprenticeship or a credential to get across. And so working with these organizations that have a standardized credential that would allow communities, underserved communities, a pathway to get to these jobs, whether they're ex-offenders or from communities that weren't as advantaged to get to those employment opportunities, that would be great.
You mean maybe an incubator or an apprentice
Could
program?
be,
I don't know. I'm just wondering.
Yeah. So I think that was one thing I wanted to bring up for you all. And if there are best practices from the My Brother's Keeper initiative, I think there's still stuff with the Obama Foundation they're working on related to that.
One thing that I will say, though, too, is one of the things we want to truly understand is when they do make that argument to not being able to find the diverse groups for these particular jobs, where are they looking? Because there's a lot of folks out there who would challenge that very notion, yes, exactly. Right? So, and also, one of the things we will look into is the question as to whether or not the qualifications they are looking for actually fit the functions of the position. I would dare to say that a lot of the leaders of these organizations aren't necessarily engineers, but they do have
college graduates,
or even college graduates, right? So, but they do have. So, we will be exploring that, and one of the reasons why we think that this is a good venue is because it will allow them to be a lot more transparent without risk or fear of that being used against them, but rather sharing challenges so that we can use other learned experiences and those who have done it successfully to share those successes as well.
Right.
There's also a lot of conversation right now about instead of a 4-year college. For many of these jobs, you don't even do a 4-year college. You do a 2-year specialized training for particular job skills. And One thing that was triggered in the discussion about philanthropy was that these companies, many of them, have a lot of money. And so to the extent you can get them interested in a philanthropy that's actually good for them too, which is a 2-year training that's a pipeline into their companies for job skills that frankly you don't have to go out and get $150,000 in debt, it is just a great solution, I think. So there's a lot of tie-ins to what's been discussed today that I think could be very helpful as we're brainstorming.
So I think a part of that, again, for the fear of inviting too many people to this table that you're proposing, is, there was a great initiative also that we did at Labor that's continuing on called TAC, like the Trade America, it was for community colleges to work with local businesses to get into these on-demand jobs. And some of these tech firms were working with local communities to do that. But inviting some of those success stories to the table, and also if there are obviously a bunch of groups that these tech companies are a part of, maybe having them at the table to be like, if we can agree on a baseline credential for allow people to get into these jobs, that might be another way to reduce that supply, gap. Sorry.
All right, Nicole, you want to go next, and then Susan and Heather, we'll let you round it out. And Rudy, I wouldn't suggest you wouldn't also be part of that discussion.
So I want to congratulate the working group on putting together some substantial efforts to figure out how to do this, given the FCC's lack of jurisdiction over this issue. And obviously, it's been an issue of the previous committees to sort of figure this out. But I would also urge I also want to put out a couple of points that I think the working group should also think about when they go in and they talk to tech companies. I think this definition of what constitutes a tech company is much more blurry. That they are both pragmatic in terms of the digital sharing economy, and some of them are very rudimentary and tied to the traditional IT skills economy. And when you begin to look at how that has actually shaped out, employment is one key of this. How do you place people in substantial C-suite positions, board, Rainbow Push Coalition talk about, even accounting assistants, lawyers, things that are non-technical. But there's also this question of how do you place them in positions where they impact the design of products and how that impacts us. So this whole concept of diversity in design is also a piece that I think is tied to employment as it looks today. And so if we're going to be forward thinking about looking at technology diversity, it's very important to look at how companies that have enabled tech to create profitable business models are also involving communities of distinct interest in the design of their products. And so I think that's an extension of this conversation that has to do with the diversity that they have in employment, because when not properly done, you actually get explicit bias, implicit bias, or unconscious bias. And that affects diverse communities. So I would put that out there. I also think the pipeline issue is really important, but I think it's also in developing the questionnaire and, again, focusing on these working groups, as it's been suggested, to sort of dismantle and unpack some of these perceived barriers to improving upon pipeline. But there's also this piece that I think is also important for people to, for our committee to look at, which is the nature of the future of work and how the pipeline, again, may be more intuitive. When I go out to Silicon Valley, outside of not looking at people that look like myself, I also see a different skill set that may not just be based on a coding background, but it's based on how they actually imagine the world, which in some cases is good, and for policymakers in some cases it's dangerous. But the key thing is it's not this very, and I'll point my head over to David and Henry, right? Back in the days, there were set skill qualifications for broadcasting or set qualifications for telecom, right? And I think what tech has done is disrupted various verticals. So again, what's the skill set if you want to do tech at a big box store versus doing tech in Apple or what we've considered to be the new high-tech industry? What's the difference of doing tech in a small startup where you're collecting data to be able to do a calorie intake application versus doing tech in a place that's dealing on the areas of fintech? So I would really push the committee to sort of be more forward-thinking and to break out of just what does the representation look like, but how does the representation in many ways affect the products and services that get delivered to communities of color? And do they have the right people that are sort of checking and balancing, not just the engineering side of it, not just, the side of, I love what Diane said, like it's the venture, it's the whole ecology that needs to be brought to the table to better understand how that impacts our communities.
Thank you. Susan?
Very impressive list, but I suggest that we also look at the mid-tier as well. Everybody wants to work for Apple and IBM, but there are companies which are more reachable, who are on the ground floor, who understand the community of color as well, or diverse community, we call it now. I'm changing my rhetoric from that. For example, some of our members are small businesses. They run from about $50 to $100 million, or maybe even less than that. I'm talking about those. We in the country we have this big discussion on H-1B program. Anybody not hear about that H-1B program? And we have for many years relied on this particular visa program to bring foreign workers in to fulfill the gap. And there is resistance to it because some of my members say that corporate members say, well, I really do not need to pay so much money for somebody who can have a college degree in computer who help, who learn on the job. So now there is a fear about the president will stop or terminate or diminish the program. So corporate America is worried about the source of the pipeline for foreign workers. Okay, so looking forward, our members or Asian American business owners think that, well, how am I going to fill that gap? So this is what they've done, and this is how we can all put a corporation with the mid-tier companies and the community who need that access to training and job opportunities. Some of our members are going to the colleges or even going to places where they're high school dropouts or single moms or folks who have retired, don't have those skills. Take them into the company and give them 6 months training for free with the promise that they allow them to place them to work. And that model has worked. And we could take a look at that. And our members are many of the Asian Americans in high tech and in engineering. They love to work with you. And I see that there are projects in Wall Street and in New York with the African American Hispanic. When my friends shared that with me, I said, where are the Asians? Where are the Asians? And before, Ron Busby, the president of the National U.S. Black Chamber, is on the Honor Committee. And way back, I've known him for 8 years, as long as he's been in Washington, D.C. from Phoenix. And I said, Ron, your community need any technology help or mentoring, let me know. I'll gladly get some of my members to go into the place which is near where your communities are and help and mentor and then collaborate. Maybe we can partner together because we have certain assets in our community and you have your assets too. Together, we can be a stronger force. So think about that and see what we can bring this corporation to. There are many of them we work with. And then look at how can we use the mid-tier, the small and minority business community who are already in that space, but who understand your culture much better than those people upstairs.
Thank you. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that we've had a lot of extensive conversation on making sure we include the small business community. And I would be irresponsible if I didn't reach out and say, should this recommendation move forward, we would definitely welcome and ask any of you who have any particular companies in mind that you think would be someone we should talk to please provide us. Because one of the things, we are very adamant about trying to make sure that we get the gamut in terms of company size and impact.
a lot of the companies that both Susan and Nicole were talking about are also in Los Angeles, with the whole Silicon Beach area in Los Angeles, which has become huge in the last 5 years. And there's a whole enclave in Santa Monica that is Silicon Beach, where there are a lot of these incubator startup companies that are all right in the same area. So that's something else to think about.
We should have done this in February out in California for the month.
Yeah, exactly. Heather, if you will allow me to have Rudy go, because I want you to have the last word on this. So,
I'll be brief because Nicole answered some of my questions short. But that's okay, though. That's okay. You always do that. But one question I do have is, how does your definition of tech, how does that differ from ICT sector? I'm wondering, of course, you would think that tech is within ICT, but in reading the definition, it sounds a lot like just, the ICT sector, and I'm wondering if that's the focus, or is the focus tech? Because on one hand, you want to focus on the core functions, but yet I imagine that, there are aspects that may be different. For example, firms that operate in regulated environments, for example, is maybe one area of distinction. There may be a distinction in terms of development as well, historical development. It'd be interesting because IBM is an interesting case where IBM has been around forever, but who would say IBM is not a tech company, right? So I recognize it's not entirely clean, but I'm wondering, how did you guys think about that in developing the definition? And it seems to me that ICT seems to be very much reflected in the definition, and how is that distinct from tech?
I would agree that it is in large part, you are correct. But we also thought about a lot of instances. So, I mean, the easiest example that I could give is the example where you had the CEO of Under Armour saying Under Armour is a tech company. And while it's undoubted that technology is influencing and permeating throughout all aspects of American business and, frankly, society, we were trying to distinguish those companies that provide or enhance services through the use of technology. So, for example, the subcontractor that creates the software program that is being used to read the health data information and analyze that, they might qualify versus just the company, the doctors, for example, right, who is utilizing that information. Right. So that's why we're trying to get toward, it's not a clean. One of the things we struggled with was understanding that because technology is so pervasive, that it is hard to make a clean break. So at least with respect to this, we wanted to be able to make sure that we limited a lot of the tangential services outside of the tech industry.
Right. If I can, you might want to go to the Department of Labor report that actually did the EEO. They did a nice, clear definition of tech diversity when it came to, and I'm pointing to David because when I was at MMTC, we were trying to justify, I think the regulated industries, I think to Rudy's point, may have those markers in place for some level of accountability when it comes to employment diversity. Mm-hmm. But what the Department of Labor report basically laid out was in unregulated industries, you don't have those markers. So they embraced this definition that I think was very useful for us to distinguish between direct service tech companies versus tech companies or companies that benefit from being on broadband platforms or leveraging ICT. So I'm more than happy to be helpful in that, but there's some data that can help frame that definition.
To Nicole's point on the data, BLS does a really good job of breaking down the NAICS code. So if you're at Walmart, but they have a huge IT shop, and you're traditionally tech. If you're in that, then you're traditionally part of the tech economy.
That's right. And you have to identify where the problem is, right?
And we should marry it up with the chart you have.
That's right.
Frankly, we don't really care what they call themselves. We care about the companies that on your chart demonstrate that from a hiring perspective, they don't have a good, diverse hiring. So I think we should take your data, marry it up, and then focus, because we can't boil the ocean, but we can certainly focus on the biggest pieces of the pie that are not engaging in the right, what we think of as appropriate hiring.
I'll volunteer.
Thank you, ma'am.
Because you're not very busy, so we're
That's
Heather.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Very excited. So, this month is Women's History Month, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about women in tech. We can have lots of women in tech. We used to have lots of women in tech until the 80s. In the 50s, women were used as human programmers, and that was illustrated last year in the movie Hidden Figures that showed the contribution of 3 African American women in the NASA programs. But in addition to that, actually during that time, up until the 80s, I think over 50% of people in tech were women. And something happened in the 80s. And maybe, I don't know what happened, maybe it was that we developed this perception of who was a programmer and who was a person in tech. So in doing our analysis, we need to kind of go back and get an understanding of that history, because as a parent of a daughter and as a person who graduated in tech, there were so many barriers to me, to advisors telling me, why don't you do something simpler, to me being the only girl in my graduate class, in graduate school. So we need to look at what's happening there. One of my pet peeves is going to the toy store and seeing all the drones and the tech toys on the boys section. That in itself creates this perception of who needs to be in tech. So we need to address those perceptions. Last year, the North Carolina State University conducted a study on how women programmers were perceived. And as part of that study, they used the platform GitHub to post some programs where people could offer feedback. They found that women who submitted contributions and had their profile picture and their name on it had a lower acceptance rate than women who did not put a profile. And as a matter of fact, those women that did not put a profile tended to perform better than the men in terms of the acceptance of their submissions. So clearly there's a talent. Clearly there's a problem with perception when a woman programmer walks in a room that they're probably not as talented as a man. So, in the interest of celebrating Women's History Month, I applaud you on your work, and I look forward to seeing more research and information on how we can overcome these perceptions of the talent and the skill of women in tech. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you all for your very insightful comments. Yes, David.
Just a point of information, and that we might take note of to be sure that this doesn't play out in this way. The previous advisory committee, the Advisory Committee for Diversity and Communications in the Digital Age, on June 14th, 2004, and I have this before me because it's still on the Commission's website, adopted, and it took 5 seconds to pull it up, adopted a best practices guide called Workplace Diversity, a Global Necessity and Ongoing Commitment. June 14, 2004, the Career Advancement Subcommittee of the FCC's Advisory Committee. Among the members were Julia Johnson, Chair, Henry Rivera, myself, Maria Brennan, among others, members. We recommended, among many other things, a role for the CEO in promoting diversity structure, how to achieve workforce diversity, professional development programs, diversity management, including training, benefits, and recognized that specifically the nature of broadcast workforce was changing such that it would be better to transition to more efforts to promote retention as opposed to just recruitment. Those recommendations by the advisory committee 14 years later are still pending. have not been acted upon and are still active in the docket. The Commission hasn't gotten to them yet, but they're still waiting. Is there anything that we can do when we propose new recommendations to be sure that perhaps they won't be pending 14 years from now when some of us will be dead?
Well, at the very least, I think that gives this committee a frame of reference for at least where we've been, and perhaps a more helpful guide to where we can go. So thank you, David, for that context. And this group has a recommendation, do you not? Would you care to make that to the group, please?
Should I just read it? No.
You don't need to read the whole
So
It also, of course, is in your packet.
So the recommendation is that the advisory committee support a series of roundtable discussions and the development of a best practices guide. The roundtable discussions and best practices guide will be developed by the working group and hosted by a working group member. The working group intends to hold the first the roundtables on the West Coast, and if necessary, a second or further on the East Coast. The roundtables will focus on obtaining a firm understanding of the challenges, concerns, and success of the tech community and informing diverse and inclusive workplace.
And are you making that motion?
I am.
And do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Further discussion? All right.
When you do that, would you include the other working group? Because what you do is very basic. So you said that you wanted to, we have speakers and you want me to give you the names. If we can work together so that at least the Asian, especially in Los Angeles, in the Orange County area, is a huge Asian community. All the universities there, I think we could truly make it diverse.
Great.
We can assure you we will be reaching out to our friends on the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you. May I call the question? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Wow. It has passed by unanimous vote.
This is Ronald Johnson.
And I thank you for that. Yes, is someone on the line?
Yes, Ronald Johnson. I vote yes.
Why, thank you, sir. We so appreciate that. Anyone else? I thought I just heard you in the yays, Ron. Thank you.
Yes, I was in the A's, yes. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. If there's one thing I think we've gotten out of today's conversation, it's the fact that each group is working extremely hard and aggressively toward their goals, but that there are opportunities within the rest of the group to share both skills, talents, and resources, not to mention, as Henry and David have so eloquently pointed out, we might also need to be checking the history on what this committee has done in the past, because if we don't recognize it, we're destined to repeat it. And I think our goal for all of us is to come out with actionable items that we can all look to and say we've moved the needle. So I would encourage you to go back and take a look at what previous diversity committees have recommended, especially as they refer to your particular group's work. Second, I thank everyone for their offer of help and support, and I think we've gotten a lot of that from this meeting today. I would also like to ask if there are any public comments, anyone in the vast group we have here that it's important to make that available. Anybody looking to make comments from the public? No one over there that's dying to? Okay, great, thank you. We've got a lot of important work to do, and I think we have made some really great strides toward that. And hopefully, if nothing else, besides some great food from T-Mobile, thank you. Again, thank you. It's also given us a chance to really get to know one another better, and to be able to recognize the strengths and the resources that each one of us bring. We have some really good recommendations in front of us, which we have adopted unanimously, so thank you. And again, I want to focus that this is the beginning and how we work with the Commission going forward. Jamila, I would like to ask if we could also get OCBO to be more involved with perhaps having a representative at these meetings.
Yes.
I think it's really important. Every one of us is going to be needing to interact with them, so I think it will be helpful for them to get to know us and for us to get to know them, since it's a new office staff, if you will. So
I think traditionally they have come and actually been present at the table.
Sometimes.
Yes, so I think it was probably just scheduling, but the head of the office, Sanford Williams, has indicated that he would like to sit in on some of the working group meetings, starting, of course, with digital empowerment as they plan for their one-day event. So.
Especially because, we've worked with different heads of OCPO in the past, and with him having a new role in the last 6 months, it would also perhaps be helpful at our next meeting if we could get some comments from him about where their focus is, what their staffing is, how they work, and how we can best work with them. So if we could have that for our next meeting, I think that would be helpful for all of us. Yes, Susan.
Is the new head a political appointee?
I don't believe so. I believe he was already on the staff.
Great.
Yes,
great.
He moved within
that
the
means that he
commission.
has the depth and breadth of the knowledge of what's going on.
Yes.
And otherwise, even with that, I would like him to not only him, but bring a staff who is the executive instrumental in actually implementing it. Because we find, again, sometimes if the head talks at the bottom, the legs do not walk.
Well,
we're not getting anywhere.
Well, the interesting thing about OCPO is I wish it was a larger entity inside the commission, frankly, given all the things that we would like to have them working on it with us.
But I know, but the person who's been involved in it is also doubles up as a woman. Diane or something? What's her name? Diane?
Carolyn Williams.
Carolyn, that's
is
right.
his senior
So
person.
she doubles up in other jobs. I know FCC is a small agency. It's got to spend about $11 million and something on just small business spend compared to the $100-some million a year. But nevertheless, what it dribbles down to is impact on the private sector is important.
Yes.
So if we could have at our meetings have meaningful representation from not just the head but also the executive actually help to implement it. That would be very helpful because then we can hold them accountable. Otherwise, we're going to go through another 2004 reading of 2004 memo again.
Well, I think that would be great if we could have OCPO's participation in
I'll
this going forward. Henry, yes.
Yeah, I don't want to throw a wet blanket on the proceedings, but again, in the past, we have had OCPO participation, and we leaned on them too much. They're a very small staff.
That was my point.
And
they are very small
They can't
staff.
do everything, and they want to be helpful. But you have to use them judiciously, and you have to understand that they have limited resources. So as we dialogue with them, we just need to keep that in mind and try to use them judiciously and not pile everything on them, because if you do that, nothing happens.
They simply can't.
They can't do it. No.
They would be looking for us to supply them with a lot of the resources necessary. Now, there are things they can do. We have talked in the past about website and creating informational pieces for the website. There have been a number of things that we've talked with them about before. A lot of their challenge is not being able to get necessarily all the content and all the people. But I think having them as a part of this group is really important, if for no other reason than just so that inside the commission there is a greater understanding of what we're doing and what we're working on, and that it's something that's a more cohesive process. So, thank you.
I don't think we want them to do things. I want them to tell us where things are, who to talk to, the right people. There's a context, not to print this, do that for us. We could do that, and we can, in fact, help them out. But if they can give us the information, the real information.
And I've found them to be very willing to do that. So we will get them here and have that happen. Thank you. Are there any other comments? I want you to know we've given you 15 minutes back, but thank you for your day's worth of activity, and I especially thank those from the working group who have joined us and been part of it and clearly been an essential addition to all of our committees. So I thank you very much, and thank you all, and have a good day. We are adjourned.